Hello, today on my channel you will hear an amazing story about life. I hope you enjoy this story. This one struck me to the core. Honestly, I still can't forget it. Enjoy watching.
For the first time since the death of her parents, Margaret could say she was happy. Being the bride of a successful businessman was not a bad thing, but since she was a wealthy heiress, it wasn't about the money. Margaret simply loved Anderson and dreamed of marrying him. There were no barriers to the marriage. Margaret's father, Mr. Winston, had died in a plane crash 2 years ago, and her terminally ill mother, Mrs. Jessica, even earlier. As it happened, she had no other relatives left. Therefore, the girl often thought how it would be great to meet a good man and create a family with him, but where to find him? Margaret was a slender, attractive blonde with a touching blush, with huge blue eyes and incredibly attractive plump lips, reminiscent of ripe strawberries. It would seem that with such beauty to find a groom, a trifling matter. But Margaret wanted to be loved by her, not by the firm and the 2-story house she had inherited from her parents. Unfortunately, it was just such guys literally attacked the rich heiress, and she completely lost faith in guys. And then, finally, Margaret smiled luck in the form of a handsome and generally pleasant guy. That afternoon, she went in for a bite to eat at her favorite cafe and, ordering a coffee and a slice of red velvet cake, took a seat by the window as usual. For the first time since the death of her parents, Margaret could say she was happy. Being the bride of a successful businessman was not a bad thing, but since she was a wealthy heiress, it wasn't about the money. Margaret simply loved Anderson and dreamed of marrying him. There were no barriers to the marriage. Margaret's father, Mr. Winston, had died in a plane crash 2 years ago, and her terminally ill mother, Mrs. Jessica, even earlier. As it happened, she had no other relatives left. Therefore, the girl often thought how it would be great to meet a good man and create a family with him, but where to find him? Margaret was a slender, attractive blonde with a touching blush, with huge blue eyes and incredibly attractive plump lips, reminiscent of ripe strawberries. It would seem that with such beauty to find a groom, a trifling matter. But Margaret wanted to be loved by her, not by the firm and the 2-story house she had inherited from her parents. Unfortunately, it was just such guys literally attacked the rich heiress, and she completely lost faith in guys. And then, finally, Margaret smiled luck in the form of a handsome and generally pleasant guy. That afternoon, she went in for a bite to eat at her favorite cafe and, ordering a coffee and a slice of red velvet cake, took a seat by the window as usual. "You're not busy," Margaret heard a handsome baritone. The girl slowly looked up and saw a tall brunette of athletic build. "The cafe is half empty," she shrugged. "Yeah, sure," the stranger nodded and smiled disarmingly. "It's just that this is my favorite place. I apologize if I've disturbed you." "Please sit down," Margaret replied, obeying a sudden impulse, and smiled involuntarily. "May I?" rejoiced the lad. "You may," she confirmed with a smile. And the brunette headed for the counter. "Ice cream for the prettiest girl," he announced when he returned. "My name is Anderson, by the way, and you are?" And I'm Margaret." "That's a pretty name." "And its owner is beautiful," Anderson winked, pouring fire syrup over the creamy ice cream. The young people got to talking and immediately felt a mutual sympathy. In half an hour, Margaret felt as if she and Anderson had known each other for years. How else to explain that the new acquaintance seemed to guess all her thoughts and understood from half a word? And then there was more. It turned out that they liked the same films and books. "Have I found my soulmate?" Margaret thought. "That's the kind of guy we could do something with." The girl was suddenly ashamed of her thoughts. Anderson was about 25 or 30, dressed in brand-name clothes, and when he'd first approached, Margaret had time to look at the keys to the Lexus. If he wasn't married, he must have a girlfriend. They'd been picking up such eligible suitors since they were boys, she thought. Margaret Anderson stared at her, and from the look on his face, he clearly wanted to say something, but he was gathering his wits. "Yes," she smiled. "I wouldn't be intrusive if I asked you out to, say, the cinema." "Why not?" And yes, after the cinema there was a restaurant and a walk through the night city. And so began their affair. And soon Margaret realized that this was the man she wanted to tie her life to. But would Anderson want that? "You know, baby, I dreamed about church today, and you're all in white, so beautiful, it's breathtaking," he once said. "I think you and I could have a beautiful family." "Is that a suggestion?" Margaret asked, a little embarrassed. "Well, let's just say it's foreplay," Anderson smiled. "For the moment, I have some things to attend to, and you and I will celebrate our engagement." It was getting to be a wedding. In 2 months, the young people had never once quarreled. Day by day, Margaret became more and more convinced that their taste coincided in everything. Everything they touched was idyllic. There was only one problem with Anderson and Margaret's relationship, and was it a problem? The fact that Anderson was already married, and Margaret found out about it by accident. One day, after seeing her fiancé off, she noticed a passport on the hallway floor. He must have dropped it from his bag, the girl decided, and purely by accident looked into the document. And when Margaret, opening page 14, saw the stamp, she felt sick. What does that make it? Anderson is married, she thought in amazement. Then why all this talk of marriage? Margaret spent the rest of the evening in a state of prostration, thinking desperately, why is she so unlucky? She had finally met a decent, well-to-do young man, and he was married. So that's why Anderson had talked about getting married but hadn't done anything about it. On reflection, Margaret decided not to jump to conclusions. The morning would be wiser in the evening. "Well, if we're going to get married, you have a right to know everything about me," Anderson said. And she breathed a sigh of relief. "I really was married." Your doubt stirred again in the girl's soul. "Well, there's no seal of dissolution of marriage on it, but they don't put one when one of the spouses dies." "Your wife is dead?" "I'm sorry, I didn't know." A thing of the past, Anderson nodded. "Helen drowned. It happened a year ago. Drank a lot. What I didn't do. Coded her, put her in a clinic, and held on. No result. She'd hold on for a month at the most. Then there was no stopping her. So one day she went into the water, drunk as a skunk." Margaret didn't know what to say. Condolence. It had been a year ago. And if they'd met, Anderson had found the strength to move on and was trying to be happy again. To say she's sorry. Was she? Margaret didn't know her lover's ex-wife, so she couldn't truly regret her passing. It was a pity, of course, that a young woman had gone, but that was all. Anyway, Margaret's heart was relieved. She was well aware that all sorts of things happen in life, and decided not to focus on it. The main thing was that Anderson had not deceived her. Talk of marriage, although there was talk of marriage, was heard less and less often. Margaret decided not to rush things. Then one day she received a letter. After her father's death, Margaret became the owner of a substantial grocery company. Despite the entreaties of those who wanted to get cheaply promoted firm, she did not agree to sell. The heiress of Mr. Winston, not without the help of his deputy and a lawyer, quickly got into the affairs of the company and began to manage. To the great annoyance of the skeptics who claimed that the girl will ruin the firm, Margaret turned out to be an excellent manager. And no wonder. Not only had she inherited her father's business acumen, but she also had an economics degree, and not just anywhere, but in Germany. The firm has not lost a single partner. Moreover, it gained new ones. And that was entirely to Margaret's credit. So the letters were not new to her. Probably another commercial offer, the young businesswoman thought with satisfaction. But this was not it. Helen Morris, Margaret muttered aloud. The surname and name seemed vaguely familiar, and then it dawned on Margaret. Anderson's last name was Morris. His wife's name was Helen, yes, but she's dead. Then how can that be? Coincidence? From the outside, it looked like an ill-advised prank. Come on, who'd want to know? Margaret retorted. Then the question arose, should she tell her fiancé about the mysterious message? After a moment's thought, she decided to refrain for the time being. He might get upset. But she didn't want to keep silent either. She decided that it would be a good idea to get to the bottom of it all first, so she set to work. But she couldn't think of anything else to do. Allegedly, her late spouse had addressed her with a single phrase. Watch out. Not another word. It was unclear who or what was to beware of. Margaret looked at her watch. There were 2.5 hours left in the day. No meetings with suppliers or partners were scheduled, so she might as well leave. "I'm off," she told the secretary and left the office. "Goodbye," Margaret, the secretary, replied. "Goodbye," she nodded absent-mindedly. Margaret got into her trusty Infiniti and wondered where to begin her investigation. The heiress of the grocery company suddenly imagined herself the protagonist of a detective series, and it must be said, she liked the feeling. "Shouldn't I change my line of work?" she thought to herself. Margaret's positive attitude led her to think that she should start with the cemetery. She had no idea what she might find there, but something told her it would not be a wasted trip, and so it was. Margaret knew where her predecessor was buried. She'd taken Anderson there a week ago. "I want to order a monument for her. I need to estimate the dimensions," the groom explained the purpose of his visit to the cemetery. Once there, Margaret walked briskly to Helen's grave. Nothing horrible was found there. No act of vandalism, which she secretly feared, had taken place. The grave looked exactly as it had last time. But what then? Margaret wondered, and immediately answered her own question. Looks like someone wanted to play a silly prank after all, and I fell for it. I thought I'd play detective. It's a laugh. "Margaret," she heard. "No, it's not a prank," she said. Turning round, Margaret saw a young man of short stature. The gravedigger, she guessed, and asked in surprise, "How do you know me?" "I know the cemetery attendant," replied evasively. "That is, not exactly. It's just that I've been told you might come." "And that's who told you?" Margaret was completely confused. "You know what? Let's go to my place," the man suggested and muttered. "There's not many ears that can hear us." She was suddenly afraid. "My God, what have I gotten myself into?" she thought with horror. "Helen's grave is empty," the gravedigger began without preamble. "She's not there." "Is she alive?" Margaret asked. Nodding, he told Margaret a macabre story. A year ago, Nicholas, for that was the name of the employee of this mournful place, heard a heart-rending scream. Looking round the cemetery, he found no one and thought, "Am I hallucinating?" Nicholas went to his gatehouse, but the scream came again. Then he realized it was coming from underground. "It gives me the creeps," the gravedigger shuddered. Nicholas dug up the grave. Fortunately, the woman was alive. He picked the poor woman up in his arms, and just in time, Helen fainted. After about an hour, she came round, Nicholas recalled, and then she told me she'd been buried alive. Who whispered Margaret wonderingly, praying that her terrible guess was wrong. "The husband," replied the gravedigger. Helen begged Nicholas to shelter her. "It's a frightful man," she whispered. "I am afraid. Hide me, I beg you." "And where is she now?" Margaret inquired. "I brought Helen to my place that day, and then we fell in love, married. We're expecting a baby, and all would be fine, but Helen is afraid of her ex-husband. We did some checking and found out that Anderson has a reputation as a black widower. He eliminates brides and then embezzles their property." "More like Bluebeard," Margaret said in a trembling voice. It was only a moment later that she realized she was shivering a fine tremor. "Yes, indeed," Nicholas nodded. "But hasn't anyone reported him?" the stunned girl asked. No, the gravedigger shook his head. "They're afraid. This Anderson has powerful patrons. That's why Helen has been hiding from him for a year. And recently she happened to see you together in town and decided to warn you." "But how did she get my address?" Margaret felt like she was having a bad dream. "In the age of social media, it's not that hard," Nicholas hummed. "That Anderson guy's profile is closed, but luckily he never deleted Helen from his friends. Apparently he wants to show he honors his late spouse's memory. Helen switched to stealth mode, found you through it, and then it's a matter of technique." "But the letter came to my email," the businessman's heiress frowned. She didn't want to believe that her fiancé had turned out to be such a scumbag. "You're not busy," Margaret heard a handsome baritone. The girl slowly looked up and saw a tall brunette of athletic build. "The cafe is half empty," she shrugged. "Yeah, sure," the stranger nodded and smiled disarmingly. "It's just that this is my favorite place. I apologize if I've disturbed you." "Please sit down," Margaret replied. obeying a sudden impulse, and smiled involuntarily. "May I?" rejoiced the lad. "You may," she confirmed with a smile. And the brunette headed for the counter. "Ice cream for the prettiest girl," he announced when he returned. "My name is Anderson, by the way, and you are?" "And I'm Margaret." "That's a pretty name." And its owner is beautiful. Anderson winked, pouring fire syrup over the creamy ice cream. The young people got to talking and immediately felt a mutual sympathy. In half an hour, Margaret felt as if she and Anderson had known each other for years. How else to explain that the new acquaintance seemed to guess all her thoughts and understood from half a word? And then there was more. It turned out that they liked the same films and books. "Have I found my soulmate?" Margaret thought. "That's the kind of guy we could do something with." The girl was suddenly ashamed of her thoughts. Anderson was about 25 or 30, dressed in brand-name clothes, and when he'd first approached, Margaret had time to look at the keys to the Lexus. If he wasn't married, he must have a girlfriend. They'd been picking up such eligible suitors since they were boys, she thought. Margaret Anderson stared at her, and from the look on his face, he clearly wanted to say something, but he was gathering his wits. "Yes," she smiled. "I wouldn't be intrusive if I asked you out to, say, the cinema." "Why not?" And yes, after the cinema there was a restaurant and a walk through the night city. And so began their affair. And soon Margaret realized that this was the man she wanted to tie her life to. But would Anderson want that? "You know, baby, I dreamed about church today and you're all in white, so beautiful. It's breathtaking," he once said. "I think you and I could have a beautiful family." "Is that a suggestion?" Margaret asked, a little embarrassed. "Well, let's just say it's foreplay," Anderson smiled. "For the moment, I have some things to attend to, and you and I will celebrate our engagement." It was getting to be a wedding. In 2 months, the young people had never once quarreled. Day by day, Margaret became more and more convinced that their taste coincided in everything. Everything they touched was idyllic. There was only one problem with Anderson and Margaret's relationship, and was it a problem? The fact that Anderson was already married, and Margaret found out about it by accident. One day, after seeing her fiancé off, she noticed a passport on the hallway floor. He must have dropped it from his bag, the girl decided, and purely by accident looked into the document. And when Margaret, opening page 14, saw the stamp, she felt sick. What does that make it? Anderson is married, she thought in amazement. Then why all this talk of marriage? Margaret spent the rest of the evening in a state of prostration, thinking desperately, why is she so unlucky? She had finally met a decent, well-to-do young man, and he was married. So that's why Anderson had talked about getting married but hadn't done anything about it. On reflection, Margaret decided not to jump to conclusions. The morning would be wiser in the evening. "Well, if we're going to get married, you have a right to know everything about me," Anderson said. And she breathed a sigh of relief. "I really was married." Fewer doubts stirred again in the girl's soul. "Well, there's no seal of dissolution of marriage on it. But they don't put one when one of the spouses dies." "Your wife is dead?" "I'm sorry, I didn't know." "A thing of the past," Anderson nodded. "Helen drowned. It happened a year ago. Drank a lot. What I didn't do. Coded her, put her in a clinic, and held on. No result. She'd hold on for a month at the most. Then, and there was no stopping her. So one day she went into the water, drunk as a skunk." Margaret didn't know what to say. Condolence. It had been a year ago. And if they'd met, Anderson had found the strength to move on and was trying to be happy again. To say she's sorry, was she? Margaret didn't know her lover's ex-wife, so she couldn't truly regret her passing. It was a pity, of course, that a young woman had gone, but that was all. Anyway, Margaret's heart was relieved. She was well aware that all sorts of things happened in life, and decided not to focus on it. The main thing was that Anderson had not deceived her. Talk of marriage, although there was talk of marriage, was heard less and less often. Margaret decided not to rush things. Then one day she received a letter. After her father's death, Margaret became the owner of a substantial grocery company. Despite the entreaties of those who wanted to get cheaply promoted firm, She did not agree to sell. The heiress of Mr. Winston, not without the help of his deputy and a lawyer, quickly got into the affairs of the company and began to manage, to the great annoyance of the skeptics who claimed that the girl will ruin the firm. Margaret turned out to be an excellent manager, and no wonder. Not only had she inherited her father's business acumen, but she also had an economics degree, and not just anywhere but in Germany. The firm has not lost a single partner. Moreover, it gained new ones. And that was entirely to Margaret's credit, so the letters were not new to her. Probably another commercial offer, the young businesswoman thought with satisfaction. But this was not it. Helen Morris, Margaret muttered aloud. The surname and name seemed vaguely familiar, and then it dawned on Margaret. Anderson's last name was Morris. His wife's name was Helen, yes, but she's dead. Then how can that be? Coincidence? From the outside, it looked like an ill-advised prank. Come on, who'd want to know? Margaret retorted. Then the question arose, should she tell her fiancé about the mysterious message? After a moment's thought, she decided to refrain for the time being. He might get upset. But she didn't want to keep silent either. She decided that it would be a good idea to get to the bottom of it all first, so she set to work. But she couldn't think of anything else to do. Allegedly, her late spouse had addressed her with a single phrase. Watch out. Not another word. It was unclear who or what was to beware of. Margaret looked at her watch. There were 2.5 hours left in the day. No meetings with suppliers or partners were scheduled, so she might as well leave. I'm off, she told the secretary, and left the office. Goodbye, Margaret, the secretary replied. Goodbye, she nodded absent-mindedly. Margaret got into her trusty Infinity and wondered where to begin her investigation. The heiress of the grocery company suddenly imagined herself the protagonist of a detective series, and it must be said, she liked the feeling. Shouldn't I change my line of work? She thought to herself. Margaret's positive attitude led her to think that she should start with the cemetery. She had no idea what she might find there, but something told her it would not be a wasted trip, and so it was. Margaret knew where her predecessor was buried. She'd taken Anderson there a week ago. I want to order a monument for her. I need to estimate the dimensions. The groom explained the purpose of his visit to the cemetery. Once there, Margaret walked briskly to Helen's grave. Nothing horrible was found there. No act of vandalism, which she secretly feared, had taken place. The grave looked exactly as it had last time. But what then? Margaret wondered, and immediately answered her own question. Looks like someone wanted to play a silly prank after all, and I fell for it. I thought I'd play detective. It's a laugh. Margaret, she heard. No, it's not a prank, she said. Turning round, Margaret saw a young man of short stature. The gravedigger, she guessed, and asked in surprise. How do you know me? I know the cemetery attendant, replied evasively. That is, not exactly. It's just that I've been told you might come. And that's who told you? Margaret was completely confused. You know what? Let's go to my place, the man suggested and muttered. There's not many ears that can hear us. She was suddenly afraid. My God, what have I gotten myself into? She thought with horror. Helen's grave is empty, the gravedigger began without preamble. She's not there. Is she alive? Margaret asked. Nodding, he told Margaret a macabre story. A year ago, Nicholas, for that was the name of the employee of this mournful place, heard a heart-rending scream. Looking round the cemetery, he found no one and thought, am I hallucinating? Nicholas went to his gatehouse, but the scream came again. Then he realized it was coming from underground. It gives me the creeps, the gravedigger shuddered. Nicholas dug up the grave. Fortunately, the woman was alive. He picked the poor woman up in his arms, and just in time, Helen fainted. After about an hour, she came round, Nicholas recalled, and then she told me she'd been buried alive. Who, whispered Margaret wonderingly, praying that her terrible guess was wrong. The husband, replied the gravedigger. Helen begged Nicholas to shelter her. It's a frightful man, she whispered. I am afraid. Hide me, I beg you. And where is she now? Margaret inquired. I brought Helen to my place that day, and then we fell in love, married. We're expecting a baby, and all would be fine, but Helen is afraid of her ex-husband. We did some checking and found out that Anderson has a reputation as a black widower. He eliminates brides and then embezzles their property. More like Bluebeard, Margaret said in a trembling voice. It was only a moment later that she realized she was shivering a fine tremor. Yes, indeed, Nicholas nodded. But hasn't anyone reported him? The stunned girl asked. No, the gravedigger shook his head. They're afraid. This Anderson has powerful patrons. That's why Helen has been hiding from him for a year, and recently she happened to see you together in town and decided to warn you. But how did she get my address? Margaret felt like she was having a bad dream. In the age of social media, it's not that hard, Nicholas hummed. That Anderson guy's profile is closed, but luckily he never deleted Helen from his friends. Apparently he wants to show he honors his late spouse's memory. Helen switched to stealth mode. Found you through it. And then, it's a matter of technique. But the letter came to my email. The businessman's heiress frowned. She didn't want to believe that her fiancé had turned out to be such a scumbag. You know, Margaret, the gravedigger smiled as he looked out the window. You're about to hear it all firsthand. The appearance of a young pregnant woman in the gatehouse dashed all her hopes that she was dreaming, albeit a creepy dream nonetheless. There's an email address on your page, Helen explained with a smile. I signed with my first and last name in the expectation that they are known to you. The hope, of course, is 50-50. But what if you were lucky? At any rate, I knew the name of the unfortunate woman who was at Anderson's before me. Margaret remembered that not long ago she had converted her profile into a business account and posted an email address for potential clients. Well, that had served her well. However, something was bugging Margaret. But how come you were buried alive, she wondered. To be honest, young Mrs. Winston did not much believe the gravedigger and his wife. Did a young, healthy woman fail to defend herself? And who knows what these two men were up to? He drugged me with some kind of drugs. Then he took me to the river and threw me down, Helen said. But I was swept ashore by the current. Yes, but wasn't there an autopsy? There wasn't, the young woman confirmed. Anderson got his influential patrons involved and eventually got the autopsy not to take place. Helen was buried promptly, but apparently she was born under a lucky star. Already in the grave, the young woman came to her senses. Terrible, Margaret exclaimed. She was now quite sure that Helen's grave was indeed empty. But what was to be done with the groom now? Turn him into the police. Where's the evidence against him? You should never have gone to the police in the first place, she sighed. You can't prove anything now. I wouldn't be so sure of that, Helen objected. You can prove anything if you want to. I've got an idea. What idea? Margaret wondered, feeling the thrill of the hunt. Margaret thought it over and decided that Helen's idea would most likely work well. I'll do it, she said. They agreed to keep in touch, and Margaret rolled into town. At first there was nothing on the tape, and young Mrs. Winston even felt a little disappointed. It had been a hectic day and Margaret was disastrously busy. By the end of the day she had quickly got Helen on the phone, and when she reached home she collapsed into bed and fell asleep instantly. The next day, when she had a spare moment at work, Margaret decided to review the tape. When she saw Anderson on the screen, she held her breath and suddenly noticed that her fiancé had slipped something into the carafe into which Margaret was pouring homemade lemonade. Rewinding to yesterday's tape, she found Anderson doing the same thing and almost shrieked. How could I have been so careless? Margaret scolded herself. You could really poison yourself. When she returned from work, she immediately poured out the contents of the decanter and rinsed it thoroughly. Margaret suddenly remembered her lethargy of yesterday. She was already exhausted at work, and then she was refreshed by her favorite drink. So it was no wonder Margaret hadn't even had the energy to wash herself. She assumed that Anderson was giving her sleeping pills, and from that day on she tried to replace the contents of the carafe. Margaret also made sure that Anderson did not put drugs in her tea or coffee. But one day she miscalculated. Margaret had no idea that he had already noticed her pouring the sleeping pills out of the decanter. After taking a sip of the medical poison, the girl fainted. Well, my love, it's time, Anderson thought, and began another operation, the removal of the body. Anderson decided to wrap the bride in a rug, take her to the woods, and bury her. He remembered that both rugs were in the pantry. The woods were half an hour away. The serial killer groom thought it would be a good idea to have a hearty meal, so he went to the kitchen. He was devouring the scrambled eggs with gusto when suddenly the bride's mobile phone rang. That's the last thing I need, Anderson thought with annoyance, and considered it a good idea to answer it. He would say that Margaret had gone for a walk and forgotten her phone, but the receiver was silent. It must be said that Anderson had already changed his mind about getting married. There was no need for it. After all, he had already seized everything that belonged to the bride. The lawyer had never let him down. Hearing her ex-husband's voice, Helen became alarmed. They had called Margaret every day in the morning, but the time was approaching nightfall, and there was no word from the girl. It seems Margaret has had a drink with sleeping pills in it. Helen shared her apprehension with Nicholas. Looks like it, her husband agreed. Well, we should call the police. The police arrived just in time as Anderson, though panting, transported a heavy rug from the pantry. The pantry was a small outbuilding adjacent to the mansion, so it was impossible to get into the house undetected. Anderson Morris asked a brawny big man with a bushy mustache. The criminal was confused, but to his credit, he managed to pull himself together. Yes, that's me, Anderson confirmed. To what do I owe the honor? Will you let me into the house? Of course, come in quietly. And he said to himself, You're not doing anything objectionable, are you? The policeman entered the house and immediately found the woman insensible. What's wrong with her? Asked another policeman, a short, overweight man. So she's dead, Anderson muttered confusedly, realizing the situation was getting out of hand. How did they get here? He puzzled. A mustachioed big man approached Margaret and, after feeling for a pulse, immediately refuted Anderson's words. Alive, but unconscious, he said. Nicholson, call an ambulance. Really alive? Anderson declared. And she'll be saved. Really? Really, the second employee nodded, much to your great regret. Why, unfortunately? You know better, he grinned, squinted, and asked, If you thought the woman was dead, why didn't you inform us and call an ambulance? Well, I was just about to, Anderson mumbled. Really? Why did you bring the rug? Well, I wanted to make a bed. Can't you do that in the summer? The mustached man snorted incredulously. Why should the woman die? And, by the way, who is she to you? Listen, you, Anderson exclaimed, gathering his wits. I will answer only in the presence of a lawyer. Well, that's your right. Come with us. You'll have a lawyer. The third policeman entered the house. The witnesses have arrived, he reported to Black, from which Anderson deduced that he was in charge. The policeman found a camera in the house, and without wasting time, examined the video footage. Well, it's pretty clear, the senior police officer concluded. Anderson was given 25 years in a high-security penal colony. It turned out that he had several other deaths and other scams on him. Somebody's less lucky than you and me, Helen remarked as the women left the courthouse. That's right, Margaret sighed. It would seem that justice had been done, and that she should rejoice. But then why did it feel so heavy on her soul? Margaret's mood did not escape Helen's eyes. What's the matter with you? She asked. No, nothing. In fact, at that moment the girl was feeling incredibly disappointed. The man she loved had turned out to be a murderer. Moreover, Anderson wanted to do away with her, as he had done with 6 women besides Helen. Her mind understood it all, but her heart refused to understand or accept it. Margaret, I have a proposition, Helen said. Why don't we go to a cafe somewhere? Celebrate, if you don't mind. I'm all for it. Oh no, guys, Margaret declined. I've got a lot of work to do, and it needs to be done today by all means. So some other time. Well, another time then. Margaret didn't really have any urgency. She just wanted to be alone. A month passed. The soul wound was slowly but surely healing, and who knew? Perhaps there would have been no trace of it if it hadn't been for an incident after another hard day's work. Margaret was on her way home from work and walked into the supermarket. Filling her basket to the brim, she made her way to the checkout. "Auntie, can you lend me some money?" Margaret heard her pitiful voice say. In front of her stood a skinny boy of about 6 or 7 years old. "Where are your parents?" she asked. "I've only got my daddy. He's ill. He used to work as a loader, but now he can't. He caught a cold in his lungs and I'm hungry. I haven't eaten anything since this morning." "You poor thing," she exclaimed. "Come on, I'll buy you some food. What do you like?" "Pasta," replied the child, "and also buns and sausages." "The task is clear," Margaret nodded with a smile. In addition to pasta, buns and sausages, she bought bread, vegetables, fruit, herbs, cheese, yogurt, juice, and deli meats. "You have so much stuff," exclaimed the boy. "Thank you so much." "You're welcome," Margaret smiled. "Let's go to the pharmacy department. Let's buy your dad some medicine." "What's your name, by the way?" "Michael," the child answered timidly. "That's a lovely name," Margaret said as they loaded the groceries into the boot. She commanded the boy, "Get in. I'll drive you home in a breeze." Michael hesitated a bit, but sat down nonetheless. "Where do you live?" she asked. "It's not far." When Margaret entered the flat where Michael lived with his father, she almost lost her senses. The boy's dad looked exactly like Anderson. That can't be, Margaret thought. And then suddenly, with horror, she surmised, has he not escaped from prison? Seeing his son in the company of a beautiful, expensively dressed young woman, the man was surprised. "Dad." "This is Aunt Margaret," Michael said cheerfully. "She sped in ice. Look how many things she bought, and she bought medicine for you too." I could tell by the look in his father's eyes that he was terribly embarrassed. Still, he was forced to accept the help so that the child would not starve. When Margaret was finally convinced that it was no Anderson, there was relief in her heart. "Thank you," the man mumbled embarrassedly and coughed. "Unfortunately, I won't be able to pay you back anytime soon, but when I get back to work." "Oh, please," Margaret waved her hand. "It's a child, after all." "Oh no, I can't do that." All right, she hastened to agree. "We'll talk about it later." "Okay," the man, whose name was Kyle, nodded and suddenly remarked, "You're looking at me kind of weird." "It's just that you remind me of someone," she said, "so I was wondering if maybe you two are related." Excluded, Kyle spread his hands. "I grew up alone in an orphanage." "Well, I see," Margaret nodded, suddenly feeling like she was falling off her feet. "Okay, guys, I've got to go. It was nice meeting you." "Likewise," Kyle replied and asked, "How do I find you guys? To get my money back." What a sensitive guy, Margaret thought, and handed him her business card and left the flat. On the way home, she pondered how many coincidences there were in life after all. Margaret was sure that Anderson and Kyle were probably related to each other and had somehow been separated. She suddenly realized that she really wanted to solve this mystery, so she decided not to lose sight of them. But that was not the only reason. At first, Margaret had been afraid to admit it even to herself, but the truth was obvious. She still loved Anderson, so why not turn her attention to his supposed twin brother? After all, you might say, the same person, although, as it turned out, not quite the same. Despite the striking resemblance, Kyle was the exact opposite of his convicted brother. He kept saying that he would be sure to give Margaret the grocery money, while Anderson wanted to rip her off. All the next day, she racked her brains for an excuse to show up at their flat, but she couldn't think of anything. And when she stopped by the same supermarket after work, she saw Michael there again. "Well, hello there," she said cheerfully. "Hello," smiled the boy. "Are you coming to see us again?" "Why?" she asked, thinking happily. Now we have an excuse. And so she entered their flat. Margaret wondered where Kyle's wife had gone, but she didn't ask. What if she was an alcoholic or worse? A drug addict, deprived of parental rights. She remembered Anderson's story about his wife and grinned wryly. By the way, I should call Helen. Margaret had invited Mr. Thomas, the best doctor in town, to see Kyle, and he'd recommended a hospital stay. "Is that necessary?" the sick man asked. "You see, I have a son." "At any rate, it is desirable," replied the doctor. And looking at Margaret, he inquired, Will your spouse not take care of the child? My spouse, Kyle, stopped talking and nodded. That's clear. The wife is a businesswoman. No time for a baby. Oh, those modern young families. When Margaret realized that the doctor had mistaken them for husband and wife, she could barely contain her laughter. As for Kyle, he blushed to the roots of his hair, though perhaps it was the hot tea he'd just drunk. You misunderstand, the patient said. We're not husband and wife. I'm raising my son alone. My wife died in childbirth. Margaret shamed herself at the thought of her alcoholic wife and hastened to assure him that she would take care of Michael. We'll go to my place, she told the boy, to a big house with a pool. Really? Michael asked excitedly, and his eyes sparkled. Really? Margaret smiled. Do you really live here? Exclaimed the boy as they pulled up to the mansion. Yes, just replied the young woman. And since we're here, I guess we do. I've only seen houses like this in the cinema, the child said simply. Are you hungry? Margaret inquired. I am, replied Michael maturely. Am I going to swim in the pool? We'll have lunch first, then we'll swim. As much as your heart desires, she smiled. Margaret suddenly felt like a mum and decided there was something to that feeling. Kyle spent 10 days in the hospital, and the whole time he couldn't stop thinking about the beautiful blonde woman who had suddenly appeared in his and Michael's lives. Margaret was undoubtedly very attractive, slender, blue-eyed, and, it seems, natural blonde could boast not only looks but also intelligence. She was also kind and helpful. I think about her too much, Kyle decided. Suddenly he realized he was in love. The discovery didn't make him any happier. After all, Kyle couldn't help but realize that he and Margaret were from different worlds. Kyle didn't ask what their new acquaintance did for a living, but judging by the expensive clothes, the keys to the infinity, and the ease with which she spent on groceries and medicine, he assumed she worked for a reputable company. Clearly not a rich slacker living off her parents' money, her husband's money, or a rich lover. One way or another, Kyle wasn't her match, and all he had to do was thank Margaret for all she'd done for them, return the money, and bow out. Yeah, but then there was Michael, who clearly had a crush on her. We'll see, Kyle concluded. And the day she was discharged from the hospital, Margaret arrived. How's your health? She asked, and the man sensed that she really cared. Thank you. Much better. Well, that's wonderful, the girl replied cheerfully. Get in. Let's go. Yeah, I could take the bus, Kyle mumbled hesitantly. Well, the young woman said with a laugh, you know my address. Michael's at my place. Let's go. I've ordered a celebratory lunch. Well, sit down already. Well, Michael, let's go home, Kyle asked his son after lunch. No, the boy whimpered. Let's stay here a little longer. Really, Kyle, said the hostess with a smile. Why don't you really stay? You can even spend the night. There's plenty of room for everyone. Yes, yes, Michael clapped his hands together. Eventually, Kyle allowed himself to be talked into it. They enjoyed a swim in the pool and, after conferring, went for a walk. It's beautiful here, Kyle said approvingly, looking out over the cornflower field and the small but picturesque lake. Yes, it's paradise in the summer, Margaret said proudly. They returned home in the late afternoon. All three of them were hungry, so dinner was finished in a flash. And when Michael, tired from the abundance of impressions, went to bed, the hospitable hostess took out a bottle of old aged wine from the cellar, cut up cheese and fruit, and called Kyle to the terrace. The heat's finally gone down, Margaret said, settling into an armchair. It sure has nodded her guest. I wonder sometimes. We wait until summer to complain about the heat later. To complain about the heat, she repeated to herself. And the loader doesn't know those words. Kyle, what's your education, if it's no secret? Margaret asked. I'm an IT guy by training. An IT guy, she widened her eyes. And work as a loader. Just like that, Kyle said. Work's a little tight these days. Sometimes, though, I fix computers, phones. That's crazy. Kyle, I want to offer you a job. I'd like to find a position. I don't have one, unfortunately. But managers make good money too. Your place is where? He asked, perplexed. Didn't I tell you? I'm the director of a food company called Smack. Have you heard of it? Well, as a matter of fact, I have. Kyle nodded, remembering the business card Margaret had given him on the first day they met. Kyle had slipped it into his pocket and safely forgotten it. Would you be willing to give it a try? Margaret asked. I really appreciate everything, but I can't accept such an offer, he said firmly. What offer? Exclaimed the businesswoman. It just seemed to me that the position of manager would appeal to you more than that of loader. But if you don't want it, I won't insist. Sounds like she took offense, Kyle thought, not without surprise, and said out loud, Okay, let's give it a try. Being a manager was much more interesting than being a loader, and Kyle was doing a great job. Some people, however, looked at him askance, saying that his boss had her eye on him and had put him in a warm place. Never mind, Margaret waved her hand. I don't mind it anyway. But what if it's true? She asked quietly. The young people never realized who had made the first move. They kissed passionately and couldn't seem to get enough of each other. That same evening, Kyle and his son moved into Margaret's mansion. Are we family now? Michael asked. And Margaret is going to be my mom. Well, if she wants to be, replied the father. Of course she will, muttered the boy with conviction. And Kyle suddenly said, I'll be right back. Where are you going? Margaret wondered. Wherever I need to go, he replied evasively, and ran out of the house. Kyle returned about 20 minutes later with a bouquet of scarlet roses. When he returned, he asked in a heartfelt voice, Margaret, will you marry me? Yes, she answered without hesitation. Of course I will. Yay, shouted Michael. The news of the impending wedding of the company owner and the new manager spread through the office with lightning speed. So much for being her second-in-command. Terrence, one of the employees who was secretly sighing for his boss, muttered gloomily. Is that all that bothers you? Smirked the office manager, Mary, who in turn had a thing for Terrence. Such passions boiled in the office, and the lovers just enjoyed happiness. Together raised Michael and looked forward to the wedding, which was scheduled in 2 months. If something had overshadowed the happiness of Margaret, it is that she still did not dare to tell her lover about Anderson. On the one hand, there was nothing terrible about it. Coincidences can happen in life. But on the other hand, Margaret did not leave the feeling that their family life began with a phi. But no matter how much the rope twisted, there would be an end. One day, coming home from work, Margaret noticed something white in the mailbox. Probably from the IRS, she thought. When she looked at the return address, she felt hot. The letter was from the colony, and there was only one person who could have sent it. Kyle wasn't home. He'd gone to pick up Michael from the preschool swim class. So Margaret was alone. She sat down on the living room couch and hurriedly printed out the message. Here's admire what you've done, you creature, Anderson wrote. Do you realize my life is over? It was as if Margaret was forcing him to run scams and kill poor women. The letter was accompanied by a photograph of the ex-fiance in a prison robe. Trimmed to the nude, with a cheeky grin, he looked so repulsive that Margaret felt nauseous. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. She barely had time to hide the letter behind the sofa cushions. Is something wrong? Kyle asked, noticing the look on his fiancée's face. Oh no, she shrugged. Everything's fine. In the evening, Margaret had forgotten all about the letter. The next day was a day off. They wanted to get a good night's sleep. It had been a long week. Michael, on the other hand, got up early and went into the living room to watch television. The boy decided to make himself comfortable and put one of the sofa cushions under his head. Underneath it was an envelope. He twirled it in his hands, and then a picture of his daddy fell out of it. It was a picture of him dressed in some gloomy clothes. Michael had seen that in movies about cops and criminals, and for some reason, Dad was also hairless. You awake, hero? Dad asked. Dad, were you bald? I'm bald, marveled Kyle, and his son handed him a photo from the envelope. Good morning, Margaret chimed in. But when she saw Kyle and Michael's faces, she gloomed. Who's that? Kyle asked her. He had a feeling he was about to find out something not too pleasant. That looks like your twin brother. "And you've been hiding the fact that I have a brother all this time," the man exclaimed. "I wanted to tell you. I really did," mumbled Margaret, but for some reason you didn't," Kyle huffed. "Somehow," she exclaimed. "Yeah, if I told you why. I'm not sure you'd want to hang out with a brother like that." "Tell me. Or should I rather not?" the groom said reproachfully. "I grew up in an orphanage. I never had any relatives, not even like this, especially since we're talking about twin brothers. Better none than this one." The young woman never managed to find the words that would fully characterize the scumbag. "I did love him, but that's in the past. Now Margaret loved Kyle, but it seemed their relationship was now in question. One thing I don't understand. Why didn't you love Kyle?" Kyle pondered aloud. "Kyle, I knew Anderson," she reminded him. "I, as you recall, showed up at your place completely by accident. Maybe accidentally, maybe not. Either way, you knew and you kept quiet." "Oh, I just couldn't make up my mind to tell you," Margaret muttered in despair, and became angry with herself. "Why am I making excuses?" "Dad," Margaret, "don't fight," Michael pleaded. "We won't," Dad promised, "because now you and I are going to get out of here." There was so much longing in Kyle's voice that his son didn't argue. This was the second day Kyle had indulged in libations, and to think. Turns out he had a twin brother who was also behind bars. "Daddy, don't drink," Michael pleaded, but his father remained deaf to his pleas. "I'm hungry," the child said with tears in his voice. "You'll find something in the fridge," Kyle replied, barely able to speak, and collapsed from the stool to the floor. Michael looked in the fridge, but found nothing but frozen hams and a jar of pickles. He cried. When he calmed down a little, he decided to go to Margaret. She would be sure to feed him. Michael remembered that she lived in a village not far from the exit from the city. He had some change and, miraculously, enough for the bus. "Why no adults?" the conductor asked. "They'll meet me," Michael replied, and the woman nodded. As long as the boy paid the fare, which he did. The boy got off at what he thought was the right stop and walked towards the mansions. And then he realized that he had got off in the wrong place. The houses were mixed up with the forest. And soon Michael was horrified to find that he was lost. And then there was thunder and heavy rain. He was really scared. He sat down under a tree and wept bitterly. The rain ended as quickly as it had begun. It was dark outside, and Michael wondered in fear if there were wolves in the woods. "Oh my God," he heard an elderly man's voice. "What are you doing here?" "I was on my way to see Margaret and I got lost," Michael exclaimed. "And who would she be?" "Your Margaret?" inquired the grandfather, who turned out to be a Forster. "She is so beautiful," replied the little boy through his tears. "She has white hair. A big car." "Not much," the man summarized. "Tell you what, let's go to my place and I'll try to help you find your Margaret." After drinking flavored tea and homemade cakes, Michael was so sleepy he wanted to go to bed. "So lie down," the Forester commanded. "Where are your parents?" The boy didn't have his mobile phone on him, so there was no thought of contacting his father or mother. It would be nice to know for sure who Margaret was, but even that didn't seem to be going to happen. Anyway, why would a kid run away from home? "I don't have a mom," Michael replied sleepily. "Dad and Margaret are getting married, and she's going to be my mom. Only they had a fight and Dad got drunk because of it." I see the Forester nodded profoundly. Waking up from his alcoholic oblivion and not finding his son in the flat, Kyle began to berate himself with his last words. "God, what an idiot I am. A fucking alcoholic. This could go all the way to child welfare." "Michael," he called out and went to the balcony, hoping to find his son there. But alas, the phone that Kyle had recently bought Michael was lying on the table. It was already dark outside, so it was unlikely his son was outside. Theoretically, he could have been at one of the neighbor ones' houses. Margaret's thought struck Kyle, but of course, now that he'd cooled off, he didn't know what had come over him. In fact, it wasn't that big of a deal. Margaret simply could not dare to tell him about her brother, and he blamed her for all sorts of things. Apparently, Margaret was in a relationship with Anderson, and quite possibly feared jealousy as well. What an idiot, making a scene out of nothing. I'll apologize for that. Kyle cheered up a little and dialed Margaret's number. "I just wish she had Michael." Michael's lost Margaret screamed in a voice that was not her own. Yeah, how could you? Scold me, Kyle thought doomfully. I deserve it. But what good is self-abuse? How long ago did he leave? She asked stiffly. I see Margaret cut her off, and with metal in her voice told Kyle to wait for her. God, you stink, she said in disgust. How are you going to work tomorrow? Kyle smiled involuntarily. Margaret was talking to him like a strict wife. He liked that an awful lot. I just wish she'd forgive me. But first, Michael. What's the cabin? Kyle asked. A woodsman, I guess Margaret suggested with a shrug and handed him a fruit gum. Here, chew on your booze. They say peppermint is better, but the fruity one's fine. Thanks, Kyle muttered quietly. You, the young woman shook her head reproachfully and couldn't resist smiling. Kyle realized he was forgiven and sighed in relief. When the young men entered the ranger's cabin, Michael was sleeping peacefully on a comfortable bed. Why didn't you watch the baby? The Foresters shamed them. There's a lot of bad people out there these days. It just happened, Kyle mumbled, and Grandpa took a closer look at him and nearly lost his mind. It can't be, he blurted out. What is it? Kyle asked. It's just that you look a lot like my dad when he was young, just the same face. No, not that, he sighed. And Margaret was in solidarity with him. They'd had enough of these coincidences. It's just that I recently found my twin brother under not so good circumstances. The Forester suddenly turned pale. Oh my God, the older man exclaimed, and the lovers literally felt with their skin that another secret was about to be revealed. But this time all must be well. Twin brother, you say? Guys, how about some tea? They drank an incredibly delicious currant drink, and the Forester, whose name was Jonathan, reminisced. Many years ago his wife had given her children to an orphanage. A cruel act, of course. But it wasn't that simple, he said. Annie was unwell. Then Jonathan went hunting and was attacked by a bear. He took a beating from the bear. The man thought he wouldn't make it, but he did. Jonathan was rescued by a gamekeeper. It took him 3 months to get home from a remote part of the forest. In the meantime, his wife, certain that Jonathan was no longer alive, became depressed. She got on a bus one day and took the boys to an orphanage, but she never told me which one, the Forester said with a sigh. You weren't looking for us, Kyle asked. Well, if that's us, of course. I'm pretty sure it's you, Jonathan said with conviction. Looking for us, of course. But Annie couldn't even explain very well which orphanage she'd turned you into. There were several in the neighborhood, in different communities, and you were nowhere to be found. I thought you'd been adopted. Besides, some orphanages were closed and the kids were taken to other cities. After all, I was away for 3 months. What happened to your wife? Margaret inquired. Annie was diagnosed with a severe mental disorder and soon she was gone. The story the Forester told was not a positive one, but Kyle felt a sudden warmth in his heart. Michael had been found, and wasn't that something to be happy about? Plus, he'd found his brother and his father, and even the fact that his mother had abandoned him and Anderson like unwanted kittens didn't dampen his happiness. All 3 of them were silent. Each was thinking about something else. Dad, Margaret, aren't you two fighting anymore? Michael's voice broke the silence. No, my golden one, the young woman replied fondly, and everyone laughed with relief. The probability of parentage is 100%, announced the female lab employee solemnly. Thank you, Kyle thanked her with a smile. Now he had a father, and Michael had a grandfather, and this grandfather had saved his grandson from spending the night in the woods. It was no other way than Providence had led them to each other. And Kyle had a brother named Anderson, and no matter how much Margaret resisted, he was determined to keep in touch with him. Blood from a sibling is not water. What if he doesn't want it? The bride asked. And my husband. Men like Anderson don't care about anything but money. We'll see, Kyle said philosophically, and Margaret knew he was determined. But she didn't have time to worry about her ex-fiancé. First of all, today was the last fitting of her wedding dress, which Helen, her future maid of honor, was helping her with. And secondly, she had a visit to the gynecologist. Yesterday, the happy bride took a pregnancy test, which showed 2 stripes, All that remained was to find out when a new life had been born in Margaret. "Kyle, are you very busy?" she asked. The young woman had just come out of the doctor's office, and she couldn't wait to tell her fiancé the happy news. "I'm always free for you," Kyle assured her. "Like a disciplined subordinate, though," he added. "A little busy." "Well," commendable Margaret said cheerfully, "and what do you say, as a future two-time father?" "I'll say I'm the happiest man in the world," he shouted. The little girl was a miracle. As blonde and blue-eyed as her mother, she looked like a little princess. The caring one was Michael. He cared for his little sister in such a touching way that Margaret sometimes had tears of sympathy. And today his son had made a cake of biscuits. Cassandra was 1 year old today. "She's going to be a pastry chef," said Grandpa Jonathan, who was a frequent visitor to the house. "Not the worst profession," by the way, the daughter-in-law replied. "Getting plugged into the family business. Isn't that bad?" "Who's arguing?" Michael was busily running around the house, helping his mother set the table, and soon Kyle arrived, laden with bags from the children's specialty shop. His husband entered the house with a huge pink-colored stuffed elephant and a bunch of balloons with painted dolls on them, and on the largest of them was a glittery inscription, "Happy Birthday, Princess." The little girl looked at all this splendor with delight, and the hearts of her parents, grandfather, and brother swooned with love and tenderness for the youngest member of the family.
Helga and Andrew were together for almost 3 years. The woman believed that marriage was almost a settled issue, because at first her beloved constantly said that in just a little while they would have free funds for a luxurious celebration. Embarrassed, Helga tried to explain that she didn't need any big celebrations. But the man, hugging her tightly, convinced everything should be perfect for my beloved girl. The best restaurant, a luxurious dress, a stunning photo shoot so that years later we can show the wedding album to our children with such speeches. Helga completely lost the ability to argue with her beloved and patiently waited for Andrew to finally decide that the accumulated funds would be enough for all his ideas. The woman sometimes felt that her partner was fooling her, but he skillfully supported her faith in a happy future. And in the end, she even defended him in front of her relatives. My mother, who moved many years ago following her new husband to the other side of the country, constantly received Helga in phone conversations and correspondence in instant messengers. "Daughter, take off your rose-colored glasses. Since your Andrew says he loves you but still doesn't want to get married, run away from him. He just settled down comfortably, living on everything he had ready, and you don't even have the right to vote to defend a modest wedding, as you want." Brother Denny prudently did not meddle in his sister's affairs. But his wife, Lily, completely agreed with her mother-in-law and convinced Helga, "Honestly, it's a pity to watch how you waste your life. Yes, it was enough for me to see how this Andrew treats you once to understand that nothing worthwhile will come of you. Besides, as far as I managed to catch, his relatives are not at all happy with you. Do you remember how many times he took you to visit your parents?" Helga, in love, tried to protect Andrew. Lily continued to persuade, citing, as it seemed to her, an ironclad argument. If they greeted you normally, you would happily go to them. To this, Helga had nothing to say. On Andrew's side, her relatives were not at all delighted with her, and the young woman was even disgusted to remember how the face of her beloved mother grimaced when she named her profession. Helen, Andrew's sister, did not remain silent and loudly asked, "So do you do a manicure?" "That's cool. I file and paint my nails all day long. Granny, can you hear?" She shouted towards the kitchen. Andrew will now always go with a manicure and pedicure, and will probably get it too. Helga was not shy about her work, but she was very uncomfortable. In addition, Andrew, after sitting at the table for a while, explained that he needed to make an important call, and went out onto the landing. The man returned when his mother was already putting the cake on the table, and Helga was exhausted by Helen's questions and malicious jokes. She was ready to howl. She wanted to send the whole company and the women looking condescendingly at her to hell. And had the beloved stayed even a few more minutes, most likely the guest would not have been able to stand it, and told the hostesses everything she thought about their snobbery. As if to atone for his escape from the holiday dinner on the way home, Andrew was especially courteous to Helga. In general, the woman in love decided that she would not overreact to the unkind reception given to her and enjoyed the company of her loved one. A year has passed since Helga moved in with Andrew. The second year flew by, the third year was coming to an end, and no changes in social status were foreseen. Moreover, Helga began to guess that her beloved had ceased to be faithful to her. Outwardly, everything was almost the same as before, but small details gave Andrew away completely. At first, he stopped picking her up after finishing work. He made an excuse by saying that he had to stay late because of a large order. And she believed and felt sorry for the unfortunate man who has to do everything for himself and for others. He eagerly flew away with everything that was prepared for his arrival, and completely stopped inviting her somewhere to unwind, as was their custom so recently. Now, after dinner, Andrew lay down on the sofa or sat near the game console to complete the next level. Helga tried to initiate joint entertainment, but it seemed that nothing could move Andrew from his favorite places at home. "Baby, I'm so exhausted," the man explained. "Give me at least a little rest. You're smart, and you understand perfectly how tired I am." Helga quietly stepped aside and went to clean, do laundry, or do some other work. Recently, it has become painful for her that upon returning home from work, Andrew was not eager as usual to hug her, but first hurried to the shower. Helga tried not to force things and not to strain the relationship, fearing that scandals would lead to a breakup. The only act that the woman did against the will of her beloved was that in the second year of living together she brought a small puppy into the apartment, at a quick glance at which it was obvious that there were many breeds among its ancestors. Can you imagine? Someone threw it in a tied bag in the trash. I threw out the trash. I hear some rustling. I thought that the rats were completely insolent and weren't afraid of anyone. And then I realized that someone inside the bag took it out, untied it, and there. Helga looked helplessly at her loved one, who was wincing from the story told to him as if from an attack of toothache, and spoke categorically. "I have nothing against animals, but you'd better take this flea-beard one to where you found it. He's scary, like some kind of hobbit." Helga objected. "He's not scary. Very charming, too. The paws are so furry. Listen, let's call him Frodo." The woman gave a lot of arguments. And finally, although without much enthusiasm, Andrew agreed. The puppy remained in the apartment and grew up to the delight of Olia. She considered him her best friend, and partly caring for the baby distracted her from thoughts that it was time to give birth to a child. However, before this important event, Helga hoped to one day hear a marriage proposal. She had particular hopes for a joint vacation, which they had planned almost 6 months in advance. But suddenly Andrew changed his mind and explained. "Listen, take someone for your company and go on vacation without me. At work, the project won't be completed without me. We'll relax with you sometime later." Out of solidarity, Helga also did not go to warmer climes. Besides, she didn't want to burden Andrew with caring for Frodo. She took up household chores that everyone had never gotten around to before, tried to make the apartment cozy, and even did some minor cosmetic repairs on her own. Moreover, Andrew has long reproached the woman for the fact that the puppy she picked up caused a lot of destruction to the apartment. "This dog of yours does not bring any benefit, only losses from it. The door was scratched. Give her to a shelter. They will try to place her in a family. And if you really want to, you can play around with sponsoring this establishment a little." However, if in some ways Helga was ready to endlessly adapt to her loved one, then in the matter of the dog's place of residence she was adamant. "Frodo didn't do anything too terrible, and I won't take him to any shelter." The dog was a faithful companion in all walks, which Andrew increasingly refused to do. Helga sometimes felt that their relationship no longer resembled love at all, but represented a format of communication between the master of the house and the servants. The woman tried to find an excuse for her partner, but the end of the affair was very unexpected. About an hour after Andrew left on a business trip, the apartment door suddenly swung open, and Helga, thinking that the man had forgotten something, jumped out into the hallway in a t-shirt and short shorts and saw her beloved sister. Frodo, not too angrily, but carefully bared his teeth at the illegal guest, who brazenly opened the apartment with a spare key, and she rudely declared, taking pepper spray out of her pocket, "Come on, put the dog somewhere in the toilet, otherwise she won't find it enough. And let's go talk." Such an aggressive start to Andrew's sister's visit came as a complete surprise to Helga. However, she did not argue, and hiding the dog, invited her to go into the room. "In general, we need to talk seriously," the guest announced. "Mom chose an excellent match for Andrew. Profitable, unlike you. The family he ends up with will greatly help his career. And with you, he is only wasting time. So it will work for pennies. He himself does not dare to tell you about it, but he and a suitable bride have already submitted an application. There will be a wedding soon. Only he feels sorry for you, you see, and has no idea how to break this news. And there is no reason for me to start a ceremony with you. So come on, pack your things and clear the area. Leave the apartment. And don't think that you can bear everything that doesn't belong to you. I'll be watching you. Otherwise, you never know. You decide to steal something. Helga recovered from the absurdity of everything that was happening quite quickly, because she simply could not believe Helen's words and tried to shield the groom. What nonsense. I saw Andrew off an hour ago, and he said goodbye to me very warmly. Do not believe. You're right. If you want, call him and ask him directly. Helga listened to the advice and told Andrew in a few words about his sister's visit and clarified. Is it true that you are planning to marry another woman? Do I need to pack my things now, as Helen put it? The not too confident voice on the phone was the first blow for Helga. The woman sat down on a chair and heard something that instantly broke her heart. Helga, you are very good. You are the best woman in my life. But circumstances have developed so that we need to separate. Under the malicious gaze of Helen, who didn't even think about leaving the room, Helga tried not to cry, but it was impossible to hold back the tears, and she almost shouted, "Why didn't you tell me everything personally?" Andrew, who managed to collect his thoughts after the initial confusion, stopped being embarrassed and answered cheerfully. "Sorry. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about the breakup several times, but somehow I didn't want to offend you. Understand, I'm also a living person, and it's not easy for me to erase everything that happened between us." The man said something else, but Helga, putting the phone on the table, stopped listening to him. Each of his phrases felt like a dull pain in his chest, and he wanted to hide from Helen's mocking gaze. The woman, acting as if under hypnosis, began to pack her things, bitterly reflecting on the fact that the rolling suitcase she had bought for the trip had come in handy. Only now it's not a foreign voyage planned, but a move, essentially to nowhere. Helga stopped abruptly. And where did the moral strength come from? Look, I don't even have anywhere to go right now, because with a dog, it's unlikely that I'll be able to quickly find rented housing. Give me a few days, please. I'll find an apartment where the owners will let us in, and I'll take Frodo right away. Give me at least 2 days. By the time Andrew returns, I and the dog will have already left here. However, Helen was determined. Never. You never know how you will behave. And then how can I justify myself to my brother? Come on, get ready, and don't forget your dog. Listen, why are you pretending to be a naive fool, and even trying to push for pity? You probably know that my brother has always been against animals in the apartment. Only you are a benefactor. True, at someone else's expense. From what I hear, your dog is scratching the bathroom door. Andrew is right. There are only losses from you and this flea. On a good note, we should take money from you for repairs. But I'm not petty. So fold your laundry and clothes and go ahead. Sorry, goodbye. Helga became disgusted from her own gullibility and some kind of emotional blindness. She felt deep down that Andrew had not been completely honest with her lately, but she still tried not to notice any warning bells. So I waited. The bells turned into an alarm bell from Helen's shrill voice and real betrayal from Andrew. She somehow threw things, which turned out to be not so much, into the suitcase, put an almost new down jacket into a bulky shopping bag, and picked up a bag with the remains of food for Frodo in the kitchen. She acted mechanically. She opened the bathroom, put a leash on the dog, leaving the muzzle dangling around her neck, and left the apartment where she spent almost 3 years of her life. Frodo carried a bag of food in his teeth, walking sedately, and was nearby, occasionally distracting himself to mark trees that were especially interesting to him. And Helga had no idea where they were going. Both her mother and her brother's wife warned her that Andrew was too keen on getting married, but she didn't want to hear the reasonable arguments of her relatives. The beloved constantly somehow explained the impossibility of getting married in the near future. And now, Please's sister humiliatingly kicked the girl out of the apartment. Helga understood that she was left with nothing. It was possible to try to compensate for the amount of repairs made in Andrew's apartment with her money, because he bought himself a foreign car for the occasion, but the woman did not have the slightest desire to meet with this man and members of his family anymore. Outbred Frodo as a dog that she herself fed and raised. That's all the memory of the relationship. Besides, if she had listened to Andrew, she wouldn't have had a pet. Mom has long been building her happiness on the other side of the country, and going to her, of course, is not an option at all. Only Denny remains. Helga happily found a phone in the pocket of her shorts, in which she left her ex-lover's apartment, and called her brother. Without going into details, the woman asked, "Hello, can I stay with Frodo today?" The brother, sensing something was wrong in his younger sister's voice, immediately agreed and suggested, "Where are you now?" "I'm somewhere in your area on business. Maybe I should grab you and the dog?" Helga happily accepted her brother's offer and named the cafe where she often met with Lilia and her nephews as a landmark. Andrew categorically did not want her relatives to visit his apartment, and now the woman clearly saw in this behavior the frivolity of her former roommate's intentions. The daughter-in-law did not have to wait long. In the back seat of the family car and child car seats were nephews, the eldest, 7-year-old Max, and the youngest, 1-year-old George, who joyfully waved their hands to their beloved aunt and dog. Lily immediately understood from the tear-stained eyes of her husband's sister what had happened, and opening the trunk to help put a few belongings there, Helga casually remarked, "I won't even remind you that I warned you about the vile nature of your Andrew. I'll just say I'm very glad that you woke up. It was high time to end this relationship. Rejoice in your freedom, and do not be sad for someone who is not worthy of you. He's not worth your little finger." A drone and a weakling. Helga sat in the front seat. Frodo managed to sit at the feet of his hostess, very compactly for his size, and soon the whole company was already accommodated in the small apartment of Denny and Lily. Helga understood that in a family with 2 children growing up, she and her dog would greatly displace the owners, and she started calling colleagues from the salon where she worked. However, no one had relatives or acquaintances who could rent out the corner for an acceptable price. Anne's boss, however, offered an option, but the owner of the apartment asked for such a high rental price that, if she agreed to it, she simply would not have anything to live on. Max fussed with Frodo, showing his younger brother how joyfully the dog alternately gave paws, as if playing. And the 2 women watching this sweet picture smiled synchronously. Helga shrugged guiltily. "Sorry, Lily, but it looks like you won't be able to find an apartment quickly." Not even a shadow of irritation or dissatisfaction flashed on Lily's face. On the contrary, she suggested, as if making excuses, "Helga, if you don't mind, let's put you and Frodo on the balcony for now. It's warm now, and there's already a cot there. I myself enjoy watching the city there in the evenings. It will probably be a little inconvenient, but there is generally not enough space in the kitchen. There was a table with a refrigerator. They could barely fit it in. It's a pity that we haven't had time to expand our living conditions yet, but now there will be an incentive to move more actively. Then there will be enough space for everyone." Denny, who came home from work in the evening, suggested that his sister talk to Andrew like a man, but Helga flatly refused. "No, don't. You'll find more problems on your own. Let him live as he wants." Albeit cramped, but not offended, Helga spent the night in her brother's apartment, although she understood that the option of walking from the balcony through the master's bedroom to take the dog for a walk in the morning was not at all convenient. After breakfast, Lily suddenly turned to Olya with a strange question. "Actually, what keeps you in this area? You can find a job anywhere in the city." Helga shrugged. "The owner, Alice, has a chain of salons. She sometimes allows us to change locations due to relocation or when there is a vacancy." The daughter-in-law almost clapped her hands. "Look, I think I know what to do. My aunt left me with a house on the outskirts of the city, with all the amenities, by the way. Of course, no one has lived there since the winter, and a general cleaning will probably be required, but this is the normal way out of the situation. You ask your boss if she has a salon in that area and if there is free space in it, and I think everything will just work out wonderfully. Fresh air. The dog, again, is free. We will visit you. It will be really cool in the summer. I can even move there with the boys." Denny strongly supported his wife's idea. "Lily, but you're right. Really, how did this not occur to me?" Helga doubted that the boss would meet her halfway, but the idea was indeed a good one. The woman decided that she was not risking anything, even if Alice could not transfer her to another salon. You can at least try to live in Lee's house, find money, and go to work. Even if you have to leave early, the issue of housing will be resolved. And now for Helga and her pet, this was the most important thing. The conversation with Alice did not bring any positive results. However, The owner of the salon chain promised. "Helga, you are in good standing with me. So as soon as I think about opening a point in that area, I already know who I'll invite to work there. But for now I need you here. I think there is no reason for you to leave me, since getting a new job is always problematic. You understand that I do not accept lateness. So please plan your route to work, so as not to keep our visitors waiting." Fine. Olia had no choice but to agree. As a result, the woman's spring and summer were filled with numerous worries, which were mainly associated with the need to travel almost an hour one way from her temporary shelter to her place of work. It's good that thanks to Lily's friendliness and sincerity, Helga did not feel awkward. On the contrary, when the daughter-in-law and her sons, as promised, came to live in a private house, the woman became much happier. Frodo, who attracted boys like a magnet, was also not bored while his mistress was away. Denny and Lily were finally able to get a larger apartment with the help of government payments, and Helga happily tried to repay their relatives for their kind attitude. The woman, when she could, worked with her nephews, and also participated in the renovation process. Maybe it wasn't always easy to manage the active Max and Alex, who had just recently learned to walk and was diligently looking for a way to give himself a bruise, but there was finally no time to think about the unpleasant separation. Lily introduced Helga to neighbors whom she had known since her childhood, and she had a good relationship with almost everyone. As a result, the abandoned woman even gained a small clientele. Even though the part-time work was not too significant, and was sometimes even expressed in natural products, it increased Helga's self-esteem. However, she did not always try to bend to what her neighbors told her when they came for manicures. The woman cared little about the opinions of those around her, who, seeing how the dog lived calmly in the house, Frodo was given a personal chair, and he, having a not at all evil disposition, limited himself to attentive observation of everything that was happening around him, said Ook. "Keep the dog in the house." The neighbor on the left, Jane, was indignant when she came in to get her nails in order. "Look, there's a booth in the yard. Put it on a chain, and that's it. It'll be more useful. Why are you feeding him in vain?" Helga was not offended by such talk. Frodo was her true friend, and it was useless to convince a fully grown lady of anything. In addition, the dog turned out to be an excellent companion for the boys, which means that it was necessary to take special care of its cleanliness, and all advice to place the dog on the street was completely ignored. Thanks to the increasing flow of acquaintances who decided to get a manicure from her, the abandoned woman realized that her skills were in demand, and she, especially given the support of her relatives, would not be lost. Helga tried not to remember or think about Andrew. She even began to succeed. Denny was happy for his sister, who now looked much better than on the day when, with eyes reddened from tears, she appeared on the threshold of his old family nest. Lily was also happy that the girl had finally learned to smile again. Closer to autumn, Lily and her children returned to a new apartment, where quite pleasant renovations had already been made. It was time for the eldest nephew to get ready for school and explore a new territory, the desk, where he had to learn his lessons. Lily asked straightforwardly, "What, Helga, are you staying, or will you move with us? Now there is enough space for everyone, and it will be closer to work. It's a shame to spend so much time on the road." Max intervened in the conversation between the adults and said, "There will definitely be enough for everyone, and you will help me with my homework, it's true." However, Helga refused the proposal from her relatives. "If possible, I will stay here. I really liked it here. And Frodo is better here." Denny, without insisting, still told his sister, "If you get bored or sad, just let us know. We will pick you and Frodo up immediately." Agreed? Helga hugged her family one by one and promised, "If anything happens, I'll definitely tell you." "Thank you." Whenever possible, Helga came to visit her brother when her help was needed, but she always finally refused the offer to move into an apartment, saying that she and the dog were much calmer in nature. The woman did not yet suspect that soon the calm period of her life would come to an unexpected end. Golden autumn flashed by. And then, obeying the eternal law of nature, bright white snow fell to the ground and everything became gloomy. The frost has already firmly grabbed all the puddles and turned the off-road conditions on the roadway into miniature mountain ranges. Helga now had to wake up even earlier to get to work on time. But the slightly shifted regime did not bother her much. Life on the outskirts of the city seemed to come to a standstill as darkness fell. Sometimes, of course, there were noisy cars whizzing by and dogs doing roll call, but overall the area was quiet and calm. Helga liked everything here, and her pet clearly enjoyed this lifestyle. One night, Frodo suddenly began to behave strangely. He worriedly, which was something exceptional for him, touched the mistress's hand with his cold, wet nose, sliding his claws along the floor, running from the door to Helga's bed. Without waiting for dawn, the owner could not stand it and decided to take the pet out for a walk. The woman became worried what if the dog ate some kind of poison. So, we need to see how the dog behaves on the street. And sighing, Helga quickly pulled on her sweatpants and put her feet in her sneakers. Putting on her jacket, she thought that it was time to prepare winter shoes. There was hardly anything comfortable in the local store. This means that after work, you need to walk around the city's shopping centers and look for new clothes. In addition, it would be a good idea to visit construction stores and consider the option of insulating the veranda. If you approach the matter wisely, then you will get a good winter refrigerator. And in warmer seasons, the veranda can become an additional room. Of course, this idea had to be discussed with Lilia and her brother, but first we needed to at least roughly estimate how much it would cost to implement the bold idea. The dog stomped fussily at the threshold, distracting him from his thoughts, and Helga hurried to open the door. The miracle never happened. The snow never fell. The sky was overcast and quite dark. In the bright light of the lantern, the familiar courtyard looked unusual, and even somehow mysterious. Frodo immediately rushed to the apple tree that grew near the gate and began to bark, and then whined softly. Approaching, Helga saw a package lying under a tree. It only took a split second to understand that someone had thrown a small child into the yard. The woman grabbed the bundle and hurried into the saving warmth of the house, mentally reproaching herself for not immediately taking the dog outside, which clearly sensed the foundling. In the room, Helga, who had gained experience in handling small children by helping her daughter-in-law care for Denny, unwrapped the blanket and realized that it was time to change the swaddle for the girl lying in front of her. It was very fortunate that Lily left some of her son's things in the house. Therefore, there were no problems getting the little one in order. But what to do now with such a find? Helga shook the blanket to hang it on the radiator, and a note printed on the printer suddenly fell out of the lining. "I'm scared to leave my daughter to the mercy of fate, but there is no other option. Believe me, I have a compelling, almost justifiable reason for doing what I do. Take care of my girl. Heaven bless my little one and you." Helga felt uneasy. It was all very strange. It seemed that the words were sincere, but this in no way connected in the woman's mind with the cruelty of the act. It turns out that the person who dropped the child off deliberately took a risk for the baby's health by leaving her on the street rather than dropping her off in some warmer place. What if Frodo had not asked to leave? Or if she hadn't released it? Lilia became scared. But it was necessary to act, and urgently, even if it was night outside. The woman wanted to warm the milk, but was afraid that the child might have an allergy, so she decided to call an ambulance, doctors, and the police. The dispatcher, we must give her credit, sent a team very quickly. The doctors examined the baby and shook their heads when they heard Helga's confused explanations that she had found the child and did not know what to do with him. The paramedic, a middle-aged woman, advised, "We, of course, can now take the baby to a children's hospital, but, to be honest, there are no special indications for this. The girl is about 6 to 7 months old, judging by her development and external condition. She lived in good conditions. She was clearly well looked after. And being in the frosty air did not have time to harm her. Your dog seemed to sense something was wrong almost immediately, and the girl didn't even get hypothermic, fortunately. If possible, wait for the police. Actually, I have no right to say this, but the later the child ends up in a government institution, the better, in my opinion, it will be. You can give your baby warm water from a spoon. If you have zucchini, cook it and puree it. Try to give a treat if suddenly the child begins to cough, sneeze, or any other symptoms appear. Do not engage in amateur activities and call the team. You never know what we missed during the inspection. All clear?" Helga nodded her head, thinking that it looked like she would have to take time off from work today to wait for the police, because bothering Lily and asking her to come was not an option. Not only does the daughter-in-law have to take Max to school in the morning, but she also has to drag Denny across the city. Having seen off the ambulance crew, Helga, under the attentive gaze of the dog, took the girl he had found in her arms and began to rock her. Once upon a time, a woman really wanted to give birth to a child for her beloved Andrew, but the implementation of the idea somehow kept getting postponed. Only now suddenly there was such a wave of tenderness towards a defenseless creature. However, The thought of keeping the child did not arise. As soon as the morning came into its own, the woman warned Alice that she would not be able to come to work, and after listening to the boss's grumbling, for the first time she seriously thought about leaving the salon. The policeman came when the clock was already approaching noon, and immediately began asking Helga about all the circumstances of the case. The woman openly explained that she discovered the child in time only thanks to Frodo. "It's good that he raised me. The baby could have frozen if it weren't for him. Doctors said she was completely healthy and was receiving good care." Fyodor, having studied the note, put it in a bag, patted the smart dog on his wide head, and then clarified. "Well, if the doctors said that everything is fine, then I'm sending your find to the baby home." Swallowing the lump that suddenly appeared in her throat, Helga answered in monosyllables. "Yes." Deep down in her heart, she felt sorry for the girl. But the woman believed that at that moment she was doing the only right thing. Soon after the formalities were settled, representatives of the relevant police department appeared at the house, and the district police officer briefly explained to them what had happened. The found baby was taken away, thanking Helga for her concern, and the woman finally relaxed. Having treated Frodo to meat, she began to clean up the house, although it was not dirty. "I just wanted to do something, and not sit, immersed in sad thoughts about the fate of the girl." However, it didn't take long to clean up. Jane came to visit, who, as it turned out a little later, was a good friend of Fedor's wife, and was already privy to the details of everything that happened at night and in the morning. The neighbor began to lament. Yesterday I spent the night with my daughter. And here on our street I missed such an event. As a friend told me that a foundling had been found, my heart almost stopped. What kind of mother could do such a thing, cuckoo? There are no other words. It's necessary to leave a child in the cold. Ugh. The woman, having spoken, reached into her bag, took out a package, and handed it to the surprised Helga, explaining, "I collected this for your hero." Looking at him, I scolded him and called him a parasite. And it turns out he saved the child. After sitting a little longer and discussing the details of the unusual incident several times, Jane got ready to go home, saying, "Now the times have come. It seems like everything is in bulk, and the children are thrown away like some kind of garbage. Being in an orphanage is like a punishment without guilt. No matter what anyone says, life there is not easy. I know it from myself." The woman fell silent and, brushing away uninvited tears, said goodbye to Helga and left. Frodo looked with an understanding look, as if he was looking into the depths of his owner's soul, and she admitted to the dog, "Imagine, I think I would like the girl you found to stay with us. Why, you get along great with children. And I'm already at such an age that it's high time to become a mother. You and I worked out our practice on children excellently, in my opinion. So they could definitely handle one girl." By chance, or perhaps truly understanding the mistress, Frodo winked, and the touched woman hugged her faithful dog. During an evening conversation, Helga told her daughter-in-law about the girl she had found and asked, "You seem to have mentioned once that one of your classmates is raising a foster child. Maybe you happen to know how the adoption procedure goes?" Lily, it turned out, was not too surprised by the question and promised to find out all the important nuances. The next day, Helga came to work and tried to act as if nothing unusual had happened the day before. However, my thoughts stubbornly returned to the found baby and everything connected with her. Helga did not understand what reason could be good enough to abandon a child on the street in the cold. And she was so immersed in her thoughts that, while working on the nails of one of the regular visitors, she incorrectly answered the questions asked and almost ruined the drawing. As luck would have it, the owner was in the salon that day, who noted the insecure work of the master and, after the client left, invited Helga to a conversation in her small office. "What kind of nonsense have you allowed yourself to eat? Yesterday I didn't go out at all, but today it's like you're holding instruments in your hands for the first time. I understand everything. There may be personal problems. We are all human. But when troubles begin to affect the quality of work, this is unacceptable. Nowadays, there is such competition among nail service professionals that there is simply no right to make mistakes and send visitors away not completely satisfied. So Helga, I want to get an honest answer from you to a direct question. Will you be able to cope with your emotions and work normally? Or should I look for another master at the salon?" Helga had to briefly brief her boss on what had happened, and she unexpectedly softened her tone. "Oh, well, I would have explained it right away. Helping a child is sacred. I thought it was a sin that you were walking. She doesn't seem like a frivolous person, but you never know what happens in life. But still, Helga, pull yourself together. You did everything you could, and you have nothing to reproach yourself with. Unexpectedly, Helga opened up. You know, I gave the girl to the specialists, it seems, but my heart is restless. I feel some kind of responsibility or something. The insightful Alice clarified. Aren't you going to adopt her? Keep in mind, this is not taking a dog or a kitten into the house. The hassle is many times greater. True, the return is incomparable, but you need to think about everything extremely seriously. I'll tell you in advance, so that there is no misunderstanding between us. I won't put you on maternity leave. You understand, this is not my practice. But at home, as far as I understand, things are slowly going well for you. Yes, I'll be sorry to part with you, but I won't keep my place for you. No offense, of course. There is constant turnover in salons. There is no escape from it. So maybe it will be possible to find a job for you with a break, but I won't make any promises. In general, your decision should be fully informed. There was a knock on the boss's office. Administrator Lena came in and apologized and said, Alice. There, the visitor arrived a little earlier than she had been booked in, and behaved rather nervously. I offered her coffee, but she insists that she get a manicure as soon as possible, as if she expected us to lay out the red carpet for her and greet her with applause. But suddenly they offered her food. Alice, dissatisfied and gloomily, besieged the administrator. Keep your thoughts about visitors to yourself, it will be better. Turning her head to Helga, the boss summed up the conversation. I think you understood what I said. Then go and work. Helga hurried to her workplace and got down to business that brought her both money and pleasure. She appreciated Alice's frankness, which gave a complete picture of the prospects in connection with the likely changes, and decided to really think through her idea of adopting the found girl in every detail. In the evening, Helga's brother's family came to visit Helga and her faithful Frodo. The joyful boys were busy with the dog, who was happy about the return of the children, whom he considered his charges, and tolerated all signs of attention from them. At this time, the adults were discussing the details of the incident. Denny, looking straight into his sister's eyes, asked, Helga, as I understand it, you regret that the girl ended up in a state-owned house and would like to adopt her. You've always had a kind heart, but don't you think this is too much? You, of course, have experience communicating with Max and Alex. But that doesn't mean anything. Who knows what problems the baby will have? Lily echoed her husband and provided valuable information. Adoption is not a simple procedure at all. The documents required are through the roof. When my friend read out the list, my hair stood on end. I briefly outlined the situation and realized that it was not in vain. A friend who passed through the bureaucratic cordon immediately explained that you have at least 3 complicating circumstances at once. First of all, you are not married. And although according to the law this is not a basis for refusing adoption, in reality it may be considered that this is not in favor of the child. Secondly, you want to adopt a specific girl. In general, it turns out that there is a waiting list for small, healthy children. It may well turn out that by the time you collect all the necessary information, the girl will already be in the family. Thirdly, although in fact this is the most important, you don't have the necessary space of your own, George, and the share in our apartment will most likely not be enough. Noticing that Helga was sad, Lily rushed to support her. If you are firmly ready to fight for the girl, then Denny and I consulted and decided that I could issue you a deed of gift for this house. Seeing that his sister was about to burst into tears with emotion, Denny hastened to defuse the situation. However, as an option, you can urgently find a groom without material and housing problems and quickly get married. So 2 out of 2 problems will be solved with one graceful act, at least formalizing the fake marriage. Helga smiled through her tears. Well, this is some kind of fantastic option. It seems to me that it is absurd to count on him. Lily agreed. It's easier to become the mistress of this house anyway. I would never dare to give it into the wrong hands, and so he will actually remain in the family. I think my aunt would be happy. Having officially received a complete list of documents required for adoption, Helga began to obtain all the necessary certificates. She learned the wisdom at the school of foster parents, ran to doctors to pass a medical examination, visited various offices, and took a reference from her boss and a certificate of income. In addition, At the prompting of Lily and a friend, Helga asked the policeman to write a petition with a brief history of the discovery of the child, and Fedor did not refuse. In addition, thanks to a good relationship with the wife of the district police officer, he, in some unknown way, contributed to the fact that Helga was allowed to visit the found girl in the baby's home. Communication with the baby, who was named Diane, became a real miracle for the woman. She held the girl in her arms and was touched. Emotions were reflected on the small face. Even when Diane frowned or began to grunt with displeasure, Helga admired the baby. The nannies were accustomed to visits from the woman, who brought things not only for her pet, but also for other children, and sometimes they allowed her to stay with the girl longer. Although many employees have experienced some burnout over the many years of work at the baby house, they could not help but be happy that Diane, it seems, will soon find her mother. Every time Helga met a neighbor on the street, she sincerely thanked her for her help and support and offered to give her, her daughter, and her granddaughter a free manicure. Jane, they waved it off. Come on, Helga. How can I stay on the sidelines when there is practically a struggle for a child right next to me? I cannot. Let the girl have a chance to quickly become your daughter. No one deserves to end up in an orphanage, and I will help in any way I can. Thank God I have lived in the world and understand people. Fedor is a normal guy. My wife told him what kind of person you were, and that was enough for him. In general, don't worry and don't make things up. We'll have to contact you, but not for free. The money will still be useful to you. Jane and everyone who was aware of the situation tried to support her. Denny and Lily brought children's clothes, which were too small for Max and Ilya, but were in almost perfect condition. The colors, of course, are not particularly girlish, but everything is good. And the Helga ska is very maneuverable and light. Helga did not know how to thank her brother, and especially her daughter-in-law, who provided her with housing and with a generous gesture turned her into a well-to-do lady. Now the inspectors had no chance to reproach the woman for not being able to provide her adopted daughter with decent living conditions. Having run around and collected a set of necessary documents, Helga, with a restless heart, went to the guardianship and trusteeship department. The woman sincerely spoke about her experiences about the found girl, and that contact had already been established between them. Diane is happy when she sees me, smiles, wanders with her eyes, follows me when I leave. And in general, from the first moment, when I took her in my arms on a frosty night, I had the feeling that Diane was my blood. I may not have given birth to her, but I feel a real kinship with her. However, the story did not touch the hearts of strict officials one bit. I don't think that your decision to adopt a child is serious. I understand that you are single now, but you might meet a man. And what then? What if he doesn't need your daughter? What decision will you make then? Will you hand her back like a boring toy and stay with a man? And years later, will you constantly reproach your daughter for not building your own feminine happiness because of her? I think you need to think again. It will be better for everyone. People who have experienced severe loss spend years mulling over the decision to adopt a child. And you just decided since you found it, then the girl should a priori belong to you. This is strange, don't you think? The woman still said something, but Helga, stunned by the refusal, no longer understood much of the meaning of her phrases. There was a noise in her head, and after awkwardly saying goodbye, she left the office because it was the turn of other applicants. As promised, Helga called Lily and told her about the negative result of her visit to the guardianship and trusteeship department. The daughter-in-law supported. My friend warned me that most likely I would have to go through a trial, but don't be afraid, this is normal practice. By the way, think again, maybe you were really excited? Try to deal with your desire without unnecessary emotions, because this is a very big responsibility. Helga said wearily. Yes, as much as I was thinking, I hardly sleep at night, almost without a break. I think around the clock whether I can give poor Diane the real motherly love and care she deserves. So far, my opinion is clear. She will definitely be better off in a family than in a government institution, where the staff most likely does not have enough time for such poor fellows. The employees there are good, but they can't give in to everyone. Well then, don't be sad. Let's use all our resources and victory will be ours. The conversation calmed Helga down quite a bit, and although she was afraid that insomnia would overcome her again that night, she fell asleep almost immediately after returning home and walking with Frodo. The woman even forgot about food. And it's good that the alarm clock on the smartphone was set in advance for the required time of getting up. However, this precaution was even unnecessary. The faithful dog, obeying some natural feeling, woke up the owner a few minutes before the nasty bell rang. Helga had to tell Alice about the failure, and the boss surprisingly provided her subordinate with moral support. I admit, I somehow admire your determination to fight for a girl you don't know. It's a pity that your running around the authorities has so far been without result. After all, as far as I understand, this means that the schedule will have to be rearranged again. Well, nothing. I think the girls will cooperate. I have plans to open a location in the area where you live, and as soon as all the formalities are ready, they will transfer you there. I warn you right away, the salary at first may be less than here, but I think there are prospects for improvement. Helga, inspired by the support of her boss, went to her workplace. A transfer to a new location could actually make her life much easier and save valuable time that she is currently spending on the road. However, for now it was necessary to act precisely in the circumstances that prevailed at the moment. Helga, whose income had noticeably decreased while running around various authorities, tried to save money, but still could not deny herself the pleasure of looking into the children's departments whenever possible to look for things for her future daughter. She had no doubt that, even through court, or even several court hearings, she would be able to achieve her goal. Once, in a special department located in a large shopping center, a woman, turning into an aisle with toys, almost collided head-on with her ex. Andrew was noticeably embarrassed and tried to hide his emotions behind a cheeky tone. "Hello, what fate are you? Are you picking up anything for your nephews? Or is there something I don't know about you?" The man, following his habit, smoothed his hair with his palm, and Helga noticed the sparkling rim of a brand new wedding ring on his finger. The meeting with her former roommate stirred resentment in Helga's soul, and she did not even try to answer him politely. "Why do you need to know anything about me?" With the hands of his sister, he threw me out of the apartment into which I, like some fool, invested money. And now, one might think, you are interested in something? Go somewhere your own way, and don't stand in my way. Andrew was taken aback. He did not expect such a rebuke from Helga, who, from her experience living together, was distinguished by meekness, tenderness, and a tendency to compromise. A man who married out of pure convenience and fell under the control of a strict wife has already regretted that he followed the lead of his family and entered into this profitable, but clearly unhappy marriage. The years spent with Helga now seemed to him the most golden time of his life. He would not mind restoring a relationship with her and receiving love and understanding from his former partner, although he was worried about how to do everything so that his legal wife would not know about the affair. Andrew understood that in this case the costs of marriage would most likely be in vain, but whoever doesn't take risks, as you know, doesn't drink champagne. Thinking quickly, the man tried to soften his impression. "Sorry, Helga. I still think that you are the best thing that has happened to me in this life. Please forgive me for hurting you. I was wrong, and I wish I could go back in time and do things differently. But unfortunately, no one has yet invented a time machine." Andrew joked, trying to evoke positive emotions in his ex. But Helga grimaced as if she had bitten off a slice of lemon and admitted, "Andrew, I was also mistaken. It was not worth wasting time on you and money on your apartment. These funds would be very useful to me now. But what can we do now? Just spit and move on with your life. Okay, no need to waste my time again. Goodbye." Andrew tried to tell Helga something else, but she hastily left the department, and he did not dare to follow her. However, it seemed to him that he still had a chance to get his modest mistress back. After thinking a little, the man deposited money on Olia's card in the amount of about 2 of her salaries, hoping that this would begin their dialogue. He imagined how the proud woman would return the amount to him, and then gradually they would begin to communicate. But Andrew miscalculated. Helga really needed the money. And having received a message about their receipts, she immediately rushed to hire a good lawyer to conduct the trial. Lily helped find the specialist, who in turn learned about him from her friend who had gone through this unpleasant process. Surprisingly, the amount received was definitely enough for the fee. Helga saw this as a very good sign and was not mistaken. The lawyer brilliantly defended the interests of her and the found baby. At the beginning of the summer, after almost 8 months of struggle for Diane, the girl was officially recognized as her daughter, and a completely new stage in their lives began. Alice, whose opening of a new salon was delayed, suggested that the employee go on paid leave for the first time. This, of course, is not a decree, but I think everything will be resolved successfully soon. You will be able to find a nanny for the girl while you work." Helga smiled happily. "Thank you very much, Alice. I have so many helpers. Just a miracle. The daughter-in-law and the boys have arrived for the summer, and the neighbors are vying with each other to offer help." The stern boss smiled. "Well, that's just wonderful. So, as soon as there is news, I will call you about the arrival of little Diane home." Helga organized a small celebration for the closest people who provided great support on the way to the goal. In addition to her brother and family, Jane and the district police officer along with her wife were invited. Those gathered tried not to make noise, and Max and George, in the company of their tailed friend, were almost constantly in the room where their new relative was quietly sleeping in the crib. Helga warmly thanked everyone who helped in her difficult task. "Consider this a little belated gift, but what a gift. Now you have a daughter, and she has you. I wish you both good health, and so that you always understand each other and be happy." After a pleasant evening, Helga, her brother's family, and little Diane remained in the house. The smart dog lay down not in his favorite chair, but right next to the baby's crib. Max ran to the adults and showed them this touching picture. "Look, Diane now has a personal nanny." Lily hugged her son tenderly. "Frodo guarded you and your brother. And while talking with you, I realized how to treat children. It's quite normal that he took the baby under his wing. Such a smart dog is simply not capable of doing anything differently." With the advent of her adopted daughter, Helga seemed to have a second wind. Lily sometimes jokingly said, "Listen, it seems like you don't even need help. You get up before everyone else, have time to clean the house and take care of the boys and daughter. It's like I'm relaxing here at a resort." Although at the stage of collecting documents for adoption, people who knew about the situation tried to warn Helga and repeatedly tried to tell her that the girl may have hidden pathologies. The fears turned out to be unfounded. That's what the old paramedic said. The baby received excellent care right up until the moment she was thrown onto the street. The girl grew up and had practically no serious illnesses, so ordinary childhood ailments. And in terms of intelligence with age, she could give a head start not only to Ilya, but also to Max. The issue with work was also resolved perfectly. Alice managed to open a new salon, where she invited Helga to work. The journey from home to work and back now took very little time, and the woman was completely happy. One day Andrew called her, and in a trembling voice began to invite her on a romantic date. And Helga, listening to her former roommate, wondered how she could even fall in love with him. After saying goodbye and pressing end, she blocked the number that she once knew by heart and felt that she had now truly turned the page on the past completely. Even if Andrew turned out to be not entirely a scoundrel and transferred money for the repairs made, the woman still did not want to communicate with him. She had already spent part of her life on him and no longer wanted to give him even a few minutes. 5 years flew by unnoticed. Diane grew up smart and affectionate, refuting all doubts about bad heredity from the parents who abandoned her. Watching the girl reach for knowledge, Helga decided to enroll her daughter in preparatory courses at school. The meeting for parents had already passed, and the woman and Diane even managed to buy all the stationery that the teacher recommended. The first lesson was supposed to take place in a week. Changes were coming, but Helga still had no idea how large-scale they would be. In the meantime, we could enjoy the still warm evenings of the coming autumn. Twilight was in no hurry to drive away the daylight, and the woman, without fear, let her daughter walk in the yard in the company of Frodo. Helga had no doubt about the dog's prudence. And even if Diane had planned a dangerous prank, her faithful bodyguard would have prevented any trouble. One day, looking out the window, a woman saw her Diane talking with an unfamiliar man. The dog stood between the interlocutors, blocking the little mistress, but Helga's heart pinched unpleasantly. Anticipating danger, she hurriedly went down the steps of the stairs, stood next to the dog, the daughter of a stranger, and warily asked, "Good evening. Did you want something? Are you looking for someone?" The man, looking up from his careful examination of Diane, looked up at the woman, and, trying not to scare anyone, said hello, introduced himself and explained, "Good evening. I'm Justin. Have you heard of such an entrepreneur from the neighboring region?" Helga shook her head and the man continued, "Apparently I need to talk with you about the events of almost 6 years ago. It so happens that it seems that you have perfectly solved the problem that you acquired because of a person close to me. There can be no excuse for what happened in the past, and I am indebted to you forever." Helga's legs almost gave way. She realized that the man had a direct relationship with the girl whom she raised as her own daughter, and frantically wondered what to do and how not to scare the little girl with unexpected information. Unable to think of anything better, the woman asked Diane, "Daughter, take the apples and take them to your grandmother together with Frodo. Sit there and entertain her a little." Otherwise, she complained that her relatives had not come to visit for a long time. "Play something, and in the meantime, I'll talk to our guest. Don't rush home. I'll come for you myself." The girl looked sternly at the man and asked with narrowed eyes, "And you won't offend my mother?" Justin put his hand to his heart and promised, "I won't offend you for anything." Diane hesitated for a few seconds, and then turned to the dog. "Frodo, let's go to Grandma. I'll just carry the apples, otherwise I know you. You won't be able to carry half of them." The dog, who adored his owner, only waved his tail in response. Helga watched Diane and dog go out the gate and invited an unexpected visitor. "Why are we standing on the street? Let's at least go to the veranda. Otherwise I feel the conversation will be long." There was a table and chairs on Helga's veranda, and the woman suggested, "Sit down and tell me. Otherwise my nerves are already on edge." The man did not refuse the offer, and sitting on a chair, told a story that made Helga feel uncomfortable. "In the past, my family and I lived in a neighboring state, 300 kilometers from your town. My wife, Margaret, gave birth to my daughter, Dorothy. Beautiful, healthy. I tried to make life easier for the woman I love. We also had an au pair. She did the cleaning and cooking. More precisely, she was an old friend of my mother and practically part of our family. This woman raised me and treated me, if not like a son, then like an adored nephew. Aunt Isabel and Margaret received her very warmly, and she really doted on her daughter. Everything was great. Both the house and the business are well promoted, and with prospects for development right up to the capital. In general, I was so successful that my competitors decided to destroy me, not physically. No, not at all. On the other hand, they approached him in order to hit him harder. They wanted to trample him mentally. And for me, this was worse than death. As I found out completely after the fact, a person was hired who studied all the information about my wife, found an approach to her, and then began a secret affair with her. It's probably a banal story. But being in this whole situation is so disgusting that all the comedy is not even felt. I would almost not blame my wife for her affair, if not for the sad consequences. One day I received photographs by email in which my wife and a man I didn't know were having fun. At first I just wanted to break her neck, but I pulled myself together to do the irreparable and instructed a good friend to check if the pictures were real. You never know, maybe it's editing. But the timid hope was dashed by reality. Margaret did have some fun on the side. Moreover, the pictures were definitely fresh, because they showed a tattoo that she had done quite recently. Of course, it's also my fault that my wife fell for it and cheated on me. I was always missing at work. One issue urgently needed to be resolved, then another. Of course, Aunt Isabel took care of the household chores, but it was my support that Margaret needed. It was this thirst for warmth and participation that this scoundrel caught her. I don't know how I was able to survive the betrayal then. I spoke harshly to Margaret, but within the law, without assault. She cried, promised that she would break off the connection, which jeopardized our marriage. I loved her very much then and decided to give her another chance, without even realizing that this would be a huge mistake. About a week after Margaret and I had an unpleasant conversation, and we seemed to agree to try to save our marriage, she disappeared along with her daughter. Aunt Isabel's wife told her that she needed to go to the children's clinic for a scheduled appointment, and she left home. This has happened before. Therefore, there was no reason not to release them. When Margaret and Dorothy did not return for dinner, Aunt Isabel became worried and began calling my wife to find out if it would make sense to reheat the food. But the phone was unreachable. Even then, there was no alarm. Aunt Isabel told me that Margaret and her daughter seemed to be late at the clinic, where appointments are usually on time and there should be no queues. And she asked to go there, saying that her heart was not in the right place. I rushed and found out that Margaret and her daughter had not appeared there at all. That's when I got worried. While driving along the route to the house, I was looking through my email and, having opened a letter demanding money and naturally a ban on contacting law enforcement agencies, I almost got into an accident by sharply slamming on the brakes. I did not officially contact the police. I was very afraid that I was being watched or wiretapped. And as best I could, I calmly drove to the house, and through Aunt Yu, whom I sent away from the house, fearing the wiretapping, I contacted a good friend so that he could help unofficially investigate the disappearance of his wife and daughter. He advised me to agree to all demands, and I did everything exactly according to the instructions of the criminals, and began to wait for news. I believed that I could make up for this money. But terrible information came. The police department called me and informed me that they had found Margaret's burnt-out car. There were 2 bodies inside, an adult woman and a baby. An examination followed. It was established that both lasting bodies belonged to my own girls. Aunt Isabel had a heart attack, and as a result, almost on the same day, 3 people, without whom I could not imagine my existence, ended up in their graves. I then began to get drunk almost every day, and some kind of supernatural anger helped me not to completely slide to the very bottom. I wanted to find the people responsible for the deaths of Margaret, Dorothy, and Aunt Isabel. But it was no use. The man seemed to have disappeared. My ill-wishers seemed to calm down. They even expressed sympathy. But running the business became completely uninteresting to me, and I sold it. Almost for next to nothing. You could say that he gave most of the money to charity, and he gradually began to learn to move on with his life. Justin fell silent, and Helga became perplexed. If the examination found that his wife and daughter died, it turns out that Diane cannot be involved in this tragic story. Why then did the man come to them? Was the expert mistaken, and the visitor buried someone else instead of his wife and daughter? The man seemed to have considered these unvoiced questions in Helga's eyes, because he spoke again and startled the woman with his confession. You seem to have already guessed that the girl you are raising is my daughter. Helga involuntarily began to shake her head, unable to say anything. And Justin, realizing that it was difficult for a woman to accept such news, gently began to tell him further. With difficulty, with the support of my parents, who themselves could barely hold on after the news of the death, but I stopped drinking. Although he changed his field of activity, he went back to business. What else did I have left? I didn't want to upset my parents, so as not to lose them. This is how I spent these endlessly long years, stretching from the moment I last saw my wife and daughter. I never became close to a single woman, fearing betrayal. And 2 days ago, returning from work, I saw a female figure at the gate of the house. I was surprised after all. Strangers usually don't wander around our ranch. I thought that maybe one of the neighbors' housekeepers or nannies needed something. He drove up and got out of the car. I come closer, and it's Margaret herself standing in front of the gate. She was emaciated. There were bruises under her eyes covering half her face. But undoubtedly my wife appeared before me, swaying. Of course, I was afraid for my own mind, suspecting that I had gone crazy. I went to visit my wife and daughter at the cemetery, and then suddenly there was such a turn. Margaret fell to her knees in front of me and began to beg for conversion, but I had no time for these sentiments. What worried me more was not even the fact that under the name of my wife, some other woman had found her last refuge in the churchyard. The most important thing for me was to find out why Margaret returned alone and where my daughter went. I dragged my wife into the house and began asking questions. And the more she talked, the worse I felt. It turns out that on the day of her disappearance, Margaret went to meet her lover, but not for fun. The man decided to get money from my wife using a video that he shot secretly and promised to post on all available networks in order to disgrace her, and at the same time undermine my business reputation. How Margaret cried when she said that she decided to take Dorothy with her, so that after meeting her lover she could drop into the clinic. The scoundrel decided to up the ante and said plans had changed. The money that Margaret brought was not enough for him. He demanded that she live in one of the houses as a living toy. Neither tears, nor pleas, nor promises of money could bribe this cynic. The only thing my wife could agree on was to save her daughter. So that the baby could not be recognized, she was changed, and her lover allowed Margaret's note to be printed on a printer, but not written by hand. Moreover, he strictly warned that if the text contains a hint of the name of the girl or her parents, then Dorothy will not survive. Laughing, he said that he would not feel sorry for the child. Frightened Margaret, of course, agreed to everything. She, naive, thought that I would certainly look for my daughter. And I didn't know that a lot of people were involved in this, and that false cases had already been prepared and the expertise was bought on the vine. Margaret was in some country hotel, and she was entertaining the crowd. And a week ago I managed to escape and get home. She may be exhausted with obvious health problems, but she accomplished the almost impossible and gave me hope. After listening to my wife's story, I realized that our daughter might be alive. We had to bring heaven to earth, but we managed to find the bribed expert and even get on the trail of the found little girl, about the same age as our Dorothy. It's good that Margaret roughly figured out how long they had been traveling before Dorothy was taken from her. It's just a miracle that you haven't moved anywhere. Otherwise, the search would have been delayed. It will probably be difficult for the girl to accept the truth, but Margaret and I are her parents. In fairness, it is we who must educate and raise her. We, of course, want to offer you compensation. We'll pay you any amount you name. Helga felt bad only in her worst dreams. People came to her and tried to take Diane away. A woman would jump up screaming from such visions, invariably frightening the sensitive Frodo, and sometimes even her adopted daughter, who was generally known to sleep soundly. And now the nightmare is happening in reality, and it's impossible to wake up. The silence that settled on the veranda dragged on, and then Helga went on a tirade. Do you want to know what compensation will suit me? I'll tell you, simply leave me and my daughter Diane alone. I don't need anything more from you. Let me raise my daughter in peace, and don't dare interfere in our lives. A baby is not a toy. And for that matter, your wife has no excuse. Why the hell did she go there with her little daughter? It was clear that she was going towards the criminal. Again, this man of hers could easily do anything to the girl, and how would your thick-headed wife control him? Oh, he allowed her to print the letter. What a benefactor. Do you know that your daughter was planted under that apple tree for me? Frosty night. Did you see the dog that stood in front of your daughter? It was he who sensed that someone had appeared in the yard. If it weren't for him, it's scary to even think what would have happened to the baby. She was essentially left to the mercy of fate. Will it freeze or not? Do you think I'll give you my daughter so calmly? What for? No, I will fight and will definitely win. We are used to exchanging everything for money. Everything is for sale. Do you think you just need to name the price and you can calmly ruin fate? Who do you think you are? Helga took a breath and realized that businessmen have much more opportunities. She was frightened by the prospect of being left without a daughter and began to convince the man. You are an adult, and you understand that it will be difficult for a girl to change something in life. How can I explain to her that she will now have two mothers? Diane grew up in my arms. She's used to me and loves me. Can you imagine how much harm this unexpected news could cause her? Please, let's leave everything as it is. I tell you, Helga, no need to shock Diane. Please, if your daughter is dear to you, spare her. Don't ruin her fate. Of course you are running a business, and they are better off financially apparently. But is it just about money? Justin wanted to object, but at that moment his phone rang so loudly that Helga even flinched from the ringing. She saw how the man turned pale, almost silently listening to his interlocutor, and guessed that the complicated tragic story had received an unexpected continuation. At the end of the conversation, Justin roared. So you were completely powerless? Is this what you want to tell me? The voice from the receiver monotonously explained something, and Helga could hear the words. We sympathize. Sorry, we did everything we could. The woman realized that something irreparable had happened, and Justin, who ended the conversation, confirmed her assumption. Margaret died. This time there can be no mistake. I put her in the hospital with a doctor I knew so that they could treat her, at least give her some vitamins, and she, after being there for a while, just went out the window. Doctors tried to save Margaret, but her body was too exhausted. She was given anesthesia. She just fell asleep. Her heart stopped beating. Justin looked confused, and compassionate Helga brought him water and a sedative from her personal supplies. Here, take this medicine, you will feel better. The man thanked him in confusion and got up to leave. However, before reaching the door a few steps, he turned to Helga and asked, Let's postpone the continuation of this conversation. I will arrive in 4 days, having previously agreed on a time convenient for you, and then we will decide what to do. Helga looked after Justin, and only when he got into the car parked at the beginning of the street, she hurried to her neighbor to get Diane, whom it turns out her parents called Dorothy. Frodo noticed the mistress in advance and opened the unlocked door for her. And Jane, who was happily playing checkers with the girl, immediately noticed that Olia had no face. After waiting for Diane to leave, Jane asked in a whisper, "What kind of guy came to see you? Ex yours or what? I really wanted to call Fyodor so that he would look at you by chance." Helga, who herself still couldn't believe the sudden turn of fate, did not tell her neighbor anything, limiting herself to gratitude for helping to keep the girl occupied and a promise. "I'll tell you everything later, but now we'll go. I'm kind of tired today." On the way home, Helga squeezed Diane's hand so tightly that she even playfully asked, "Mom, are you afraid that, like ours, one day I'll take a balloon and fly away?" The woman almost burst into tears, but tried not to let the girl notice her depressed mood. "Sorry, Diane, I was just lost in thought." Helga spent the whole night without sleep. She looked on the internet for all the information she could find about Justin, and was surprised that practically no sharply negative statements were published about him. Most of the articles were, of course, devoted to the misfortune that happened to his wife and daughter. Helga looked closely at the posted photos, but from the small images, and even in poor resolution, it was almost impossible to make out whether Diane or another child was in them. In the morning, after taking her daughter to kindergarten, the woman rushed to visit her daughter-in-law, warning her at work that she would be late for an hour. Lily, after listening to her, was silent for a long time, and then supported her relative. "Diane is officially your daughter. Perhaps her father can go to court. But it seems to me it is better to try to resolve the matter peacefully," Helga admitted. "Lily, I'm incredibly scared. Maybe I should just drop everything, take Diane and go somewhere, so that her father will never find us?" The daughter-in-law nipped the idea of running away in the bud, without even hearing to the end what country Helga had decided to leave for. "In my opinion, doing this will only complicate everything. You say that this Justin will come to you in 4 days. This means it will be approximately Saturday. So that's great. Denny and I are also present at this meeting. And it would also be a good idea to invite the lawyer who helped Diane win the case." When Justin called Helga and they agreed on a time to meet, the woman realized that there was nowhere to retreat. The businessman, to the surprise of the woman, her brother, daughter-in-law, and lawyer, arrived alone for the fateful negotiations. He had several large packages in his hands. Having met and shook hands with the men, Justin explained the contents of his burden. "These are all gifts for my daughter." After everyone was settled, the businessman began negotiations that were more difficult than he had ever conducted. "Helga, I am immensely grateful to you for preventing Dorothy, let me call her that, from staying in a government institution for a long time. I am ashamed that I believed in the results of the examination and did not double-check them. After all, having done this, the search for my daughter would not have been stopped, and we would have met with her much earlier. I've been thinking all these days." And he made a difficult decision. "Let's not shock the girl. You, Helga, were absolutely right when you said that the truth would only bring her suffering. Let everything remain as it is. I have only one request. Under any pretext, allow me to come and visit my daughter. I won't bother you often, but at least on weekends. Let's go somewhere together." The lawyer, realizing that his services would not be needed, hurried to leave, and Justin, Denny, Helga, and Lily sat, thinking a little more about how to introduce Diane to her father. As a man who cares about the beauty of his nails and comes in for a manicure, or as a colleague, Lily came up with a brilliant idea. "Oh, what's there to invent? Justin, come as a fan. Then gifts for Diane would be appropriate." Everyone agreed on this option. And Lily's idea turned out to be very promising. In the process of communication, sincere sympathy arose between Helga and Justin. A year after they met, which began with extreme stress, they got married, and the man legally became the father of his own daughter. A little later, he resolved all the issues in his hometown and moved to Ole and Diane to always be close to those he loves.
Emily opened her eyes. She felt the dirt under her fingernails and the cold, damp earth. The sensations came into her mind, not all at once, but one at a time, as if there were a narrow door that only one at a time could slip through. Emily grimaced in pain as a bright light shone in her face. It came and went. There was a terrible headache. That was the second thing she felt. Then the girl realized that she was terribly cold, so much so that she could barely feel her own body. The thought shook her so much that Emily tried to get up. She looked around, birds cawing, dirt, cold, earth, and grass with huge crosses everywhere. Realizing that she was in a cemetery, she began to breathe frequently. Panic set in. For a while, Emily couldn't even remember her own name. Then she realized who she was, but she didn't know where or why. She looked around and realized she was at the grave of her late husband. He had died only 2 years ago, but the memory of it hurt her every time. He had an ordinary grave, a black fence, a monument with a photograph, simple gray, no frills. Behind the monument was a wooden cross. Emily sighed. At least something made sense. Suddenly her gaze fell on the knoll of earth next to Michael's grave. He hadn't been here before. Who was buried so close to her husband? She looked closer and saw herself in the picture. It was impossible to make out the image in detail in the dark, but she remembered this picture of herself well. It was on her profile on all of her social media accounts. Lowering her gaze, Emily saw her name. Emily Johnson. With fear, the girl began to gulp air with her mouth. At that moment, she heard some noise very close by. When she saw 2 short silhouettes right behind her, she flinched and started to crawl back. Her short black hair was disheveled. She was wearing a black dress, no shoes, just black socks on her feet stained with dirt. "Don't be afraid of me," the boy behind her with the flashlight said quietly and calmly. He was the one shining the light into her eyes. A large dog sat next to him. "Who are you? Why am I here?" Emily asked fearfully. Her voice was weak and trembling. Nausea began to set in, and a severe pain appeared in her head. Panic was building. "I don't know. Buddy and I came here. My friend Grandpa Frank used to work here in the cemetery. He used to let me take all sorts of goodies from the graves. People leave them. And he said they'd put candy for people like me. I'd eat them, and some dead relative of theirs would smile in heaven, just like that." His words didn't make it any clearer. Emily looked apprehensively at the huge dog. It was acting friendly, wagging its tail and looking at the boy. He looked to be about 12 years old, blonde, a little overweight, with slanted blue eyes and rosy cheeks. He wore a yellow jacket and a black hat. The jacket was a little small for him. "I don't understand," Emily said. "I told you Uncle Frank let me take candy, but that's from the graves. And today I came in and they told me he was gone, that he was sick and couldn't work anymore. He's been replaced by his replacement. He's angry and drinks. He wanted to send me away, but I tricked him, pretended to leave, and came back. Grandpa Frank showed me a long time ago where there's a crawl space on the north side. Me and my buddy went in and started collecting candy, and he heard you. I didn't realize it at first, and he started digging your grave. I couldn't pull him away. He's digging at me like a real builder, what he's talking about, and I started to help him. It turned out you were buried shallow. The coffin was open and right on the surface. Grandpa Frank told me all the dead people are buried 2 meters deep. It was right next to here when a friend dug up a little bit of your grave. I heard you standing there too, realized you were alive and opened the coffin lid. It wasn't boarded up. How should it be? Emily was horrified. Who buried her? Why? It was hardly an accident. If the coffin hadn't even been pinned up properly and buried deep. "How are you not afraid to walk around here alone and dig up groupies?" she asked. "I'm used to the cemetery by now. Grandpa Frank used to say you shouldn't be afraid of the dead. You should be afraid of the living. But I haven't seen the living dead yet." Of course, yeah, Emily rose to her feet. Her whole body shook with cold. "When I opened the coffin, you started climbing out right away. That's when I got a little scared. It was creepy. and then you lay there for a long time, like an hour. Come with me. I live nearby. I'll warm you up with tea. Just be quiet. My stepfather won't let me bring anyone. Emily nodded. She had nowhere else to go. She followed the boy, her friend running beside her, wagging his tail happily. Her rescuer's name was Bobby. His mom had died 7 years ago. He didn't even remember her. He was already living with his stepdad. He was a very bossy man. He'd fix anything, help anyone, but he drank a lot. Sent the kid out to pick up alcohol from graves. That's how Bobby became friends with the caretaker. Grandpa Frank taught the kid to be sneaky, saying they don't let him in the cemetery with alcohol now. They only let you keep candy. That's what the boy did to keep his stepfather from drinking. But of course, it didn't help much. They lived badly, poorly. Since he was little, Bobby was able to wash and iron and cook for himself, and also fed his stepfather from childhood. The boy had no childhood. Emily learned all this in the short time it took them to walk to his private little house. The cemetery was far outside of town. She'd been there often since her husband's death, but after a year she'd been less frequent. She needed to let him go and learn to move on. Emily promised herself to go there no more than 3 times a year, on Michael's birthday, the date of his death, and her wedding anniversary. For the past year, she dutifully kept her promise, and she wasn't supposed to be here until March of the following year, but somehow she'd managed to die on November 8th. How that had come about was a mystery. Her memory gave out information about the last days of her life selectively, in fragments. She couldn't remember the last events, but she didn't want to go back to the city to her apartment yet. There was little chance that she had been mistaken for dead, so she thought. Then she would be given a proper burial. Emily sat in the outhouse where Bobby had brought her, drinking hot tea. The boy wrapped himself in a blanket and sat beside her. A friend she often wiped his paws on before letting him indoors. This child was overly responsible for his years. I saw in a movie that a certain uncle was killed, and to avoid confessing to the crime, they buried him. Maybe that's what happened to you too, Bobby suggested. He was sitting close by. There was a dim light bulb on in the outhouse, and it was warm, but not warm enough to take off his jacket. On the wall hung photographs and Bobby's childhood drawings. In the corner was the usual garland of colorful bulbs. No, I'm buried next to my husband. He died 2 years ago. So whoever buried me, knew where my husband was buried, Emily thought. Michael sighed heavily. The boy settled on the mat on the floor. Won't your stepfather come in here? Emily asked. No, he's drunk again. You don't have to wait for him tonight. He'll wake up for lunch, sore, yelling at me, just like he always does. The neighbors have already called social services. I lived in an orphanage for 6 months, but he made a deal with someone. He took me back. He needs the child benefits that pay for me, and when he drinks, he says I look like my mom and he loves me. Except he doesn't care about me. He did when I was little, but not well. I was often sick. Neighbors nursed me back to health. Grandma Tisha lived across the wall from us. She's dead now. But she used to consider me her grandson. Helped my father raise me. She told me a little bit about my mom. When my grandmother died, I was 9. And then I became an adult and independent. I can be responsible for myself now. I still have a little bit left. I want to grow up soon, Bobby said. Emily smiled. She wanted to say, don't be in a hurry to grow up. Childhood is wonderful, but adulthood is full of challenges and worries, but that wasn't the case with Bobby. He had already grown up, but he hadn't grown up yet. He had had a difficult childhood, and adulthood was bound to make up for it. It should give him a loving, caring wife, children, friends, and he should never have to fight against the world alone, picking candy from graves and listening to his drunken stepfather. Emily sighed, looking at the boy. Time will fly by quickly. You'll see, she told him, and smiled. They talked for about an hour. Bobby was an extremely talkative young man and very bright. As she talked to him, her memory began to come back to her. She looked at the chubby cheeks of the boy with the beautiful blue eyes, and scraps of the last day flashed before her mind's eye. She remembered Jessica and the fact that she had tried to help her. Emily and Jessica had been best friends since college. They had bonded and quickly found common ground, being two against all odds, trusted each other unconditionally. When Emily met Michael, Jessica was jealous, but found it in herself to be happy for her friend, as she usually was. Their meetings became infrequent. They were replaced by the daily routine of married life. Emily was happy. She was glowing. The only sad part was that she and Michael never got to have children. When he died, Emily turned gray with grief, trying to take her own life. Jessica got there just in time, supported her friend the whole time, and they became close again. 2 days ago, Jessica had to drop her off at a fortune teller she knew for the second time. "It's been a year. You still haven't recovered," Jessica was saying. "Is that all normal?" "No, not normal," her friend argued. "You need to say goodbye to your husband and move on with your life. This woman can talk to the dead. It's not like a cheap TV show. She really connects with them, sometimes giving people details that only their deceased loved ones could know about. Charges a lot for her services, but only if she manages to contact the person. She says not everything is in the public domain. Some people are allowed to talk to her, and others are forbidden. You know, it's awfully interesting. I was in contact with her myself when my grandfather died. She calmed me down and told me that he said hello and asked me not to get into his gear, to wipe the fishing rods clean of dust, and rather fish like he did. She said he is with his grandmother now, and they are arguing again. Said his whole family is there, and he is happy to see me and know there is no death and no eternal separation. I looked at the world differently after that." "Oh, nonsense," Emily replied dejectedly. "But you're just torturing yourself with guilt. You can't do that. So you had a fight. Who doesn't? How can you beat yourself up like that?" The day before Michael died, Emily was jealous of him. She'd long thought he was hiding something. Dark, she became suspicious. She found an outgoing text message on his phone to an unknown number. "You too, of course," she thought some woman had texted Michael saying she loved him, and he erased her message and so replied, only he didn't have time to delete his own reply. She saw it. Michael claimed that the number belonged to his coworker, his boss, and congratulated him on the fact that the bonus would be at the end of the month. And he wrote "you too" to congratulate her, because she would be getting a bonus for overtime. Emily wouldn't make a big deal out of nothing, but this was not the first time she felt he was cheating on her. Every time there was some excuse, and she couldn't prove anything. She thought she was going crazy with jealousy, blamed herself. But that night she couldn't help herself. She tried to push Michael. He got angry, yelled at her, and left. They had a motorboat. They lived near the river. The boat was later found wrecked, and he was reported missing. But they said, "Dead don't get your hopes up." Emily stopped living when Michael was gone. She stopped believing in God and the devil. She lived out of inertia just because she had to live. She came from a wealthy family. She didn't need money. She hired a psychologist and worked with him, but not for long. He kept making her cry, reminiscing, hurting her, and she just stopped going to his sessions. 2 days ago, Jessica picked Emily up, and after work, they got in her car. They drove out of town. The same fortune teller was going to tell them something important about her husband. The first session Jessica had dragged her friend hadn't gone very smoothly. It was over a week ago. The elderly grandmother with the piercing brown eyes said that Michael was angry. He hadn't forgiven Emily and was asking her to explain herself. Emily didn't know how to respond. He said so. "Not me," the fortune teller excused herself. Jessica paid for the session. It had been her idea. Emily refused to go. "He was harsh on me too. That day, Michael could just calm down, explain. If that text wasn't for a mistress, then why did he refuse to call that number in front of me? I know his coworker. I would have recognized her voice. I've had my suspicions for a long time, and with his death, they haven't gone away. It's only gotten worse. We had a very bad breakup. Emily started crying. Michael said, "You had no right to be jealous." Emily sensed something was wrong. Michael was always reconciling after a fight. She was sure that if he hadn't died in the motorboat accident, they would have reconciled and forgotten all about it. She even considered not to forgive him at first. The quarrel was not good, left a residue, and suspicions had long tormented her. She wanted clarity. She wanted to know the truth, to believe, but she couldn't. The last thing she remembered. Jessica talked her into going to that fortune teller again. She didn't want to because she'd left her in tears last time. "We should go. She won't take any money. She says Michael didn't tell her everything, that he's keeping her awake and making her contact you. Let's go. It's free. What have you got to lose? If you don't believe me, don't believe me. Let's just hear her out and go. And put it behind us. And maybe you'll feel better after what she said." Emily agreed. She got into the car with her friend. What happened next was hazy. Jessica gave Emily some salted peanuts. Half an hour later, she was thirsty. "I have a thermos of tea lying in the back seat." "Yeah, sure," Jessica tossed over her shoulder. She was focused on the road. Emily decided to take a sip from the thermos. One, another, a third. "It tastes weird." "What is it?" she asked. "Kazakhstani tea. Very good, healthy, some kind of herbs." That's all I could remember. After that tea, there was a complete memory lapse. It was as if she hadn't even realized how she'd blacked out. One thing became clear. Jessica couldn't have had anything to do with her fake funeral. "What's on your mind all of a sudden?" Bobby asked. The boy had been staring at her in silence for several minutes now. Emily shook her hair. The black dye was visibly disheveled. It was creepy for her to be in a black funeral dress, but needing to figure out what had happened. I remembered everything she said slowly. Remembered what? What? Emily told the boy the events of the last few days. She spoke simply so as not to offend him with her silence. After all, he was the one who had dug her out with his dog and brought her in warmly and gave her tea. Emily was still coming around. The drowsiness and weakness in her body had only gotten worse. "You just don't go back there. What if that Jessica wanted to kill you?" "Yeah, she miscalculated. Maybe she planted arsenic." Emily shuddered. She felt sick, like she'd been poisoned. Could it be true? But the thought of her best friend wishing her harm seemed unbearable to Emily. Her thin fingers encompassed the mug of tea. My head hurt. I didn't even know if I'd have to go back anyway. I wasn't dead. And it's not clear what's left in the cemetery. I'll pick it up tomorrow, and no one will notice. Are you moving it here? I'll go inside. He might wake up. He'll fight again. The last time I was outside, the social services came to see him. He gave me such a beating. I said I'd be home before dark. I hope he's still asleep. Bobby went inside, saying he'd be home in the morning. He left the dog on the doorstep. The dog had been taught commands and obeyed his little master without question, and Bobby never left his friend hungry. Even at the worst times, he found a treat for him in the trash cans, and for himself, too. During the night, the memories that her psyche must have separated from her mind for a while came flooding back. If she had just slept in unconsciousness until her release, it wouldn't have been so bad yet. But Emily began to remember waking up in the coffin. She was nauseous. The lack of oxygen was pressing in her head. A slight fear gripped her entire being. All night long, those memories made her shudder with terror. There was nothing more terrifying than a death like this. Emily's parents had died years ago. She had been an orphan. and Jessica had been the nearest and dearest person to her for a long time. Could she have done this to her? Or was it an accident? But then why did they bury her so ridiculously, superficially? There were too many oddities in all this. It couldn't have been an accident. In the morning, she heard her stepfather yelling at Bobby she wanted to stand up for him, but she cried most of the night. And she felt terrible when the yelling stopped. Bobby came into the outhouse with his dog. "I brought you some waffles. Do you want some?" he asked. Emily shook her head. She would have to go to the hospital, get checked out, find out, at the very least, what had caused her death and why in heaven there had been a cancellation. "Thank you. I'll be coming back. I have my own apartment in the city after all. I have somewhere to go." "What if someone lives there now, one of the people who wanted to kill you?" "Let me go and find out. I'll ask the neighbors. I'll tell them you helped me before, and no one will suspect a thing. Will you at least know how you died and who buried you?" Emily shrugged. She explained to Bobby how to find her apartment. "Only I don't have the money to even get you a ride." "Yeah, well, they put you in the coffin without a wallet. But don't worry. I'm harebrained," he smiled. "What if you get caught?" Bobby squinted slyly. "I have a conductor I know who doesn't charge me. Always gives me a treat, too. I was walking my dog once, and a dog jumped him, and my dog protected him, chased the dog away. We've been friends ever since. He showed me to everyone on the route, so I get a free ride into town, and from there, too." "Wow," Emily marveled. "Wait a minute, you don't go. If anyone comes, hide," said Bobby. "Okay," Emily nodded. She was feeling sleepy. Bobby was saying basically the right things, reasoning like an adult. She wanted to trust someone right now. She slept in the outhouse for 2 hours before she jumped up at the rumbling. "Who the hell are you?" A huge, bearded man loomed over her. Emily realized it was Bobby's stepfather. "Hello, my name is Emily." She threw back the blanket and staggered to her feet. The man saw her face in the light and started to stagger back. "And that's you." You Emily didn't understand. His face didn't look familiar to her. "I'm sorry, Bobby let me hang around. I'll be leaving soon. It's just that I'm in trouble." "You can't be alive." Emily thought the man had white fever. He reeked of alcohol. "I'm going to leave right now. Let me go." The boy's stepfather stood in the doorway, his whole demeanor making it clear he wouldn't let go. His gaze was crazed, fear and something else in it, something evil. Emily saw a stick on the floor and grabbed it. She swung it at the man, but he didn't bat an eyebrow. "Let go or I'll hit you. I want to leave. I didn't take anything from you. I was just cold. Let me go," I'll scream. She began to choke with panic. The man took a step towards her. Emily tried to hit him, but he snatched the stick, threw it away, and hugged the girl. She thought he was going to molest her, but he only cried. "What's the matter with you?" "Let me go." "Emily, honey, is that you? Tell me it's you. I've been so sick without you." Emily raised her face to him and looked into his eyes. "I don't know you." "And you haven't lost your memory?" he asked, looking at her hopefully. He still had his arm around her. "No, you have me confused with someone else." "Now, wait." He stepped out and locked her inside. Emily decided she had to get out, but the door to the outhouse was locked very firmly and the window had bars. She couldn't get out. Soon the man came back. "You're sorry, okay? Don't be afraid of me, I'm not crazy. Here, look at this." He held out a picture to her. Emily recognized herself in it. Except she'd never had that haircut, never had those clothes, and she'd never been to the place where the photo had been taken. "Who's that?" That's you, isn't it? Look at it. It's not like I'm crazy." Emily stared at the picture for a long time. "Yeah, it's really weird. She looks a lot alike." "She doesn't look like her. She's a copy. The mole on her cheek, look. Is there such a coincidence? You have a voice like hers, too." I loved her. Emily was Bobby's mother. She's dead. A long time ago. This is the only picture I have of her. I didn't give it to Bobby so he wouldn't play bury as a memory. My name's John, by the way. You're Emily. My head hurt like hell. Still nauseous, but intermittently thirsty. She told John about who she was, where she was born and raised. She was 17 when her parents died. Her uncle had looked after her for 6 months until she came of age, then left for Poland, where he was from. The rich heiress was left all alone, not knowing what to do with her parents' inheritance. She decided to study, and she went where she could enter herself and did not tell anyone that she had $1 million in her accounts. Even Jessica didn't know for a while, and when she found out, she said that she respected her decision to dispose of her parents' fortune wisely, not rashly. She'd never been jealous, never asked for a loan. They were friends, ignoring the fact that Emily could afford anything. And Jessica had a hard time getting everything, she said, and how she ended up in the cemetery. John only remarked that her friend was probably in on it, and Bobby could really help. He's very outgoing and can get information from even a scout. John, on the other hand, told her about Amy. When I met her, she already had Bobby. I fell in love, got coded and didn't drink until the day she died. You know, if you're Amy's sister, I'd like you to take Bobby. He's your nephew after all. And out Emily raised her eyebrows. Sister, nephew. She suddenly realized that she wasn't just talking about a girl who looked like her. For some reason, that thought didn't immediately occur to her, but really because the birthmark was in the same place. So maybe a sister then. So Bobby's maybe related to me. Yeah, you're right. We need to figure this out. If that's the case, I'll take him, but only on the condition that you hang in there and live a normal life, Emily mouthed. John invited Emily into the house. She stepped inside. It was cleaned up. Only the table was left with traces of last night's libations. You must be sick, huh? You've been poisoned, you pale thing. You're like a greaseball. You should go to the hospital for a checkup once in a while. Do you vomit all the time? I'll pour you some brine and you'll be fine. The bearded man opened the refrigerator. Inside was a lonely pot, half a loaf of bread. I could see why the boy was going to the graves. Let me make some soup. Do you know how sure I can do anything? There was a chicken leg in the freezer. The only thing missing was an onion, but the soup was good without it. Emily put in more carrots. When Bobby returned, there was a hot first course waiting for him. He was surprised that Emily got along with his stepfather. He hadn't told him about the fact that the guest might be his mother's sister. The boy had only seen the picture a couple times, so he didn't catch the resemblance himself. I brought you a newspaper. Take it, read it. It's on page 5. I couldn't find out anything else. Evil people live in your rich neighborhood. They wouldn't even let me in the front door. But the neighbor said a friend of mine lives in my apartment. I signed it over to her. It's an inheritance. I opened the paper. There was an obituary with my picture on it. The cause of death was a heart attack, and at 30 years old. That's highly questionable. I had a lot of things to figure out. I've probably never had so much uncertainty in my life, and Emily felt alive in the soup. Bobby dozed off, content, satisfied. She had sworn to herself when she left their house that she would come back for the boy, even if he was nothing to her. But she needed to figure out what had happened. Emily made her way to the city. Walked to her apartment. John gave her Iris's old jacket that had been hanging in their closet for years. She couldn't bear to throw it away. Emily felt so strong in that jacket, like her sister was holding her hand. Standing at the door of Emily's apartment, I threw off my jacket. She rang the doorbell. When Jessica opened it for her, appearing on the doorstep in her robe and her favorite doggy slippers, not standing in front of her in a black funeral dress and staring menacingly into her eyes, Jessica pressed her hand to her lips. "Oh my God, it's you, you're that question again." I've heard that somewhere before. Emily's mind raced.
You poisoned me? And took my money for yourself? What kind of Emily didn't have time to finish the swear word that was begging to come out because Jessica started crying? I didn't do anything. I mean, I did, but I was hypnotized. Remember that fortune teller? She turned out to be a con artist. I didn't realize what I was doing, and she compelled me. Compelled you to sign over everything I own to herself, forge signatures.
Emily asked. Jessica sounded sincere. I've been trying all day today to remember what was in that thermos. She was the one who gave it to me. I didn't want to. I realize now what I've done, and it makes me feel so nasty. Emily, honey, I'm sorry. I was hypnotized. Do you have to believe me? Emily walked into her apartment. Jessica cried as she told how the fortune teller looked her in the eye, how she taught her what to do. She said that after Emily passed out, Jessica had taken her to the cemetery and asked to bury her. The caretaker was greedy for money. He reeked of alcohol. Jessica gave him a good sum of money, and he said it would be done in the best way. He drove himself to the funeral parlor to pick up the coffin. She was afraid to stay there, so she just left her friend without even waiting for the funeral. She was still alive when they put her in the coffin, but apparently she was too lazy to dig deep, especially since the money was weighing on her pocket. I was very thirsty. They buried her in the spot Jessica had indicated. Then she put an ad in the local paper, just to clear her conscience. And that was it. Body buried. Paperwork's forged. What I don't understand is why the fortune teller made you sign it over to yourself. What's in it for her? She had to come to me to give me half of the fortune. That's what she said. I waited for her. She made me believe that I owed her, that it had to be this way, you know? I'm terrified myself. Her hypnosis is getting weaker now. I guess it's because I saw you. I'm so glad you're alive. Jessica suddenly grabbed her jacket from the coat rack and tried to walk to the door. At that moment, the police officers entered. Going far, Lady Emily stopped by the station with her story and told the story to the investigator. He was extremely surprised, sympathized with her, and told her to go home, hide from the criminal, and wait for the operatives. Jessica was arrested, so it was the fortune teller. But at the interrogation, it quickly became clear that the fortune teller first heard about all this. However, she told another funny story. Jessica had paid her to make Emily feel guilty. And I knew right away that the man was alive, she said. Jessica found another way out. Blamed it on Michael. Turns out Emily's ex-husband wasn't dead. The boat accident was faked. He'd been living in the city and dating Jessica the whole time. He had huge debts, which is why he decided to fake his suicide. He and Jessica had been having an affair for a long time. She was terribly jealous of her friend and decided to steal away the man she loved. Jessica wondered why some people get everything and others nothing. So she decided to even the score somehow. She helped Michael fake a suicide, and his debts turned out to be Emily's problem. She was surprised. She didn't know anything about the debts, but she paid them. She wanted to leave only good things in her loved one's memory. You pulled me out of the noose, Emily said bitterly. I was wrong to show weakness. I regretted it so much later. Michael came back to life quietly and inherited everything. But you were alive and whining all the time about how much he loved you and how you loved him. And the truth was, he didn't love you. Michael was always mine. You didn't get everything. Her best friend's words horrified Emily. How jealous she must have been of her all this time, to the point of poisoning her and burying her alive. But the worst part was that Michael was an accomplice. He helped carry Emily's body out when she had already taken the poison. When she found out, she couldn't help but cry. It was painful, cold, lonely. There was no one she could trust. The police assured her that Jessica and Michael would get real jail time for what they'd done. Emily hired a good lawyer. She was scared. She wanted these people to stay where they couldn't hurt her for a long time. The newspapers were full of headlines. Risen heiress punishes her killers. Emily agreed to be interviewed by one publication. The others hyped their versions. It was funny to read, but all her thoughts now were not about what had happened, but about what she had learned. To check the twin sister version, Emily went to a specialist, and he made some inquiries. Were you adopted, Emily Igorovna? It's true. Your parents went to the clinic several times. Your mother had a unique operation for those years. But the result was the same. Multiple failures of our research institute. She was in despair and even took medication for depression. Whenever she saw a woman with a stroller on the street, she burst into tears. That's when they took you in. You were born on the same day as your twin sister. Her name, as you know, was Iris Iris Janovna, was an exact replica of you in appearance, but grew up in a poor family. Why me? How could my parents separate the twins? Why didn't they give her away? Emily asked. The truth turned out to be painful. Twins are always born early with less weight. You were more affected. You were much weaker than your sister, malnourished, slow to gain weight. When your mom was discharged, she signed a waiver on one of her daughters, and the doctors already had an order for a baby, a girl. Your adoptive parents wanted a daughter. You grew up in a wealthier, more prosperous family, became a rich heiress, and are still alive. I think your adoption was the best thing that could have happened to you. Your sister was less fortunate. Iris was drinking, in treatment for addiction, all at the age of 16. You're 17. She got clean. She got pregnant. Her parents were dead by then. Bobby, Iris's son, was born at 40 weeks, healthy. She was living a normal life too. She died of a coincidence. She got sick. She started it. An infection set in, came into a crowded hospital. There was no one to help. Her roommate John took care of the baby. She'd given birth to him by another man, from whom we could not find out, but at the alleged time of conception, she worked in a wealthy family as a cleaner. Emily, having received the address of that place, went there in person to find out as much as she could about her late sister. It was getting dark. It was snowing. She parked outside the huge 2-story cottage and approached the gate. It was unlocked. Once inside, Emily walked in high heels across the carved paving stones to the door. She rang the bell. Inside, she heard birds singing. Soon an elderly woman opened the door. You? Is that you? It can't be. Emily's mind raced again. She realized that she had now been mistaken for her deceased sister. Why not? It can. But you're dead. That's what they told me. Jesus, the woman turned pale before her eyes. The life seemed to be coming out of her at that very moment. Just then, a gray-haired, statuesque man with a beautiful and even tan showed up behind her. My goodness, what do you want here? You've robbed us and come to our doorstep after all these years. What? Are you getting shameful? Emily shook her head. That's it. That's enough. I'm not who you think I am. My name is Emily. I'm Iris's twin sister who used to work for you. And I've come to learn the truth about my sister and my nephew. Iris has a child, but she wasn't pregnant when she worked here. Come in. God, you look just like her, the man lamented. His name was Edward Paul Gray, and his wife's name was Anastasia Victoria Gray. The house was beautiful, but uncomfortable, as if it were fashionable. It was more like a museum than a place to live. There were pictures everywhere of a handsome, dark-haired man, apparently their son. I was so scared. I'm still not comfortable, Anastasia Victoria said. Why were you scared? Michael squinted. Yes, Anastasia. Did you think Iris had come back to steal something again? Her husband looked at her with disbelief and incomprehension. She sighed. Okay, I'll tell it like it is. This secret is weighing on me. Too heavy a burden. I can't carry it anymore. Your sister worked for us, and she didn't steal anything. I'm the one who talked to her. But I wasn't going to go to the police. I just needed her to leave our son Eli alone. He's too trusting. She twisted him around and started lying about being pregnant. No offense, but your sister wasn't a very nice person. Michael was hurt by her words. He felt there was something wrong with this story. You talk bad about my sister, and she's not a very nice person. Was she pregnant? Edward Paul frowned. She lied to me. I'm sure she did. And I took action, threatened her that if she told Eli about the baby, I'd put her in jail. The baby would be taken away from her. She didn't like the idea. Of course, she shut up and left. Have you been to her place, gone to see her? My husband asked me. Yes, my conscience was bothering me. I wanted to see what the child looked like. But they told me that Iris was dead and her son was living with his father. So I was right. All she wanted was a stranger's baby to tie our Eli to her. We're wealthy. Her family is, I'm sorry, penniless. And Eli is infertile. That was recently discovered. Really, since he was young, Edward added. Yes, he's married now, but they don't have children. So I did the right thing. Michael stood up. I'll bring Iris's son over here, and you can look at him. If that kid in the picture is your kid, they do look alike. Bobby's living with his stepfather now. He took Iris in with his son, but he's not his father. Michael walked away, leaving the door open behind him. He was annoyed at the way these people were talking about his sister. How could this woman know whose child Iris was carrying? Already at the gate, Emily ran into a man, the same man who was in all the pictures in the house. Hello, Emily said. The man was stunned. A tear rolled down his cheek from his eye. It's you. It's you. I've been looking for you. They told me you were gone. Oh my God. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her so tightly against him that her breath caught. I'm sorry, Eli, Emily began. She realized that she had called him by his name, that she was speaking to him in her voice, and it wasn't helping her explain her. Where on earth have you been? Why did my friend say you were buried in the town cemetery? I never dared to find the grave. Apparently you weren't there. Well, it happens. And the date of birth matches, Michael said. No, she's really dead. And I'm her sister Emily, she replied, and told him how she and her sister were separated. Ellie proved to be such a good conversationalist that she wanted to open up fully. She recounted how she woke up in the middle of a graveyard and how a boy, his son, had saved her. Told of what she had just learned at his parents' house. Eli listened to her for the first time, looking into her eyes and not wanting to let go. They stood outside his house, not even noticing how nervous his mother was. She kept pulling back the curtain. Seeing Emily made her uneasy again. It had only been a year since she'd managed to marry her precious son to a woman who suited him in every way. Anastasia Victoria Gray had chosen Eli to marry her best friend's daughter, Sarah. Sarah was a high society girl. Always impeccable looking, she knew 4 languages, but she couldn't cook at all. She was arrogant and cold. She was only interested in her job, fashion shows and stupid TV shows. Eli didn't even want to talk to her, but his mother persuaded him to get to know the girl better. Everything pressed on the fact that her father had died, that she was traumatized. That's why she was closed off. Sarah, Eli realized, was just cold and empty. He didn't see any warmth in her, didn't see anything to draw him in. But their parents were persistent. Eli and Sarah began to see each other often. They went to the theater, to the opera. Eli would have preferred something simpler. For example, he was forced to go to plays in a suit, trying to think of something clever to say after Sarah and her abstruse friends discussed the acting and the integrity of the production. He was frankly bored and didn't know how to let loose, how to escape. Eli and Sarah had a lavish, pompous wedding like she had always dreamed of. He was unhappy, and his mother saw it, but she clenched her teeth and said, "This life suits you, Sarah, wasn't suited to marriage at all." They moved into a new apartment downtown. They had everything they needed to be happy, except the most important thing.
Eli began to insist on children, and Sarah said she didn't want any. When Eli asked why she married him in the first place if she didn't want a family, his wife softened, but all attempts to conceive failed. They both got tested and found out that Eli was infertile. His parents were ready to send their son abroad, only for him to please them with grandchildren, but Sarah took him to her doctors.
She said she knew the best specialists. They all confirmed that Eli was infertile. It was a blow to him. He withdrew into himself. Marriage seemed like a mistake. Drowning in all these troubling thoughts, Eli arrived at his parents' house that evening. He got out of the car and saw her inside. Everything seemed to shrink. Everything turned upside down for a moment. He felt like he was the same person he'd been before. Eli talked about how he'd met her sister. Iris had taken a job with them when he had just returned from overseas. She was so beautiful that she didn't even need makeup. Emily had a short haircut, and Iris had a waist-length braid. He saw her and couldn't believe his eyes. Such a beauty dusting their place. It turned out that Iris was a great conversationalist, loved Brodsky, Hitchcock, and loved the same things he did. She knew the places in town that made their favorite shawarma with a unique recipe. They would walk around the city at night on foot. She didn't care that he had a car. She loved to walk on her own, to move, and she had accustomed him to it. After their walks together, Eli felt a pleasant fatigue in his legs. He would fall on his bed and fall asleep like a baby. They were just friends, but they couldn't tear themselves away from each other. They talked nonstop, as if they couldn't get enough of each other. She was the only one who made him feel alive. When Eli dared to kiss her, he expected her to push him away. He was nervous, afraid of losing her, but she responded to the kiss by pressing herself against him. Their affair lasted only a few months. Then his mother found out about it and claimed Iris had stolen her son from her. She would have denied it, but she nodded, apologized shamefully, and left their home for good. Of course, Eli followed her. He found her, but Iris refused to speak to him. "Your mom did it. She just confessed it to me. I was confused and scared when I saw you. She'll tell you herself, apparently. And I have to go," Emily said after finishing his story. "I'll see you around." He realized there was a completely different person standing in front of him, but he couldn't help himself as he looked at her. He saw Iris, yes, and talking to Emily was just as easy and pleasant. It was hard to separate the two for himself, but still, it was necessary. After all, they were two different people. "I'm bringing her son here." "I think he's yours." "Eli, no. I can't have children. You need to talk to your mom." "I think you'll learn a lot today." Emily left and Eli went to his parents' house. The conversation was hard. He was angry, grabbing his head, crying. His father and mother hadn't expected this reaction. "Mom, what has she given up to you?" "Johnson isn't a father. She's a redneck, a servant. She's stupid." "Not our level indeed." Eli sank tiredly onto the couch. "She was better than all of us. Better than all of us. I loved her, and now she's dead. And if the baby is mine, I will never forgive you," Eli said as he looked his mother in the eyes and walked away. He didn't know when Emily was coming over. He canceled all business appointments and had been waiting in his car outside his parents' house for her since 8:00. "Why are you sitting here? My mother got divorced. Why are you doing this to her? You know how she is. She always wants the best. She separated me from a woman who was pregnant. If Iris said the baby was mine, then it was mine. I have no doubt about that. It turns out my mother separated me from my child, broke my life. And if Emily hadn't found us, I never would have known I had a son at all." His words were bitterly true. His father nodded. "I didn't expect her to do that either. I mean, she always wanted grandchildren, didn't she? So what? That the girl was poor. I liked Iris, but I thought she really stole," he said. "Anastasia convinced us all of that and intimidated the girl, so she never showed up on our doorstep again. That's how you live with someone for so many years and don't even know what they're capable of."
Toward evening, Iris returned, got out of the car, and Bobby walked beside her. Ely walked over to the boy. My God, the way he was staring at him. Bobby has her nose. And the rest of him is mine. He's a carbon copy of me. I was fair-haired and easygoing when I was a kid too.
Ely looked at Emily. She was wearing a long black coat, white snowflakes laying on her short hair. Her eyes looked with tenderness. He still saw her as his love, but he was already aware that she was different, and this did not upset him. On the contrary, he wanted to get to know her better. "We should take a test," Emily said. "I don't even know where they do those tests. I've looked into it. If you want, they'll take us in right now. I just want to say right off the bat that Bobby will be living with me. He doesn't know you at all. And I won't trust him to your mother, I'm sorry." Ely was confused. They both realized that a father would have every right to his son. But after what his mom had done, he didn't argue. "Okay, just let's go over to my place. I want to show him to his grandmother," Ely said. The boy, who had been standing still all this time, suddenly asked, "So you're my daddy, are you? I don't get it." Ely was dumbfounded. "I knew your mom well. You didn't say anything to him?" Ely asked Emily. The woman shook her head. "We have a lot to tell you. But first, I want a woman to see you. She'll probably cry." "You don't freak out. It's necessary," Ely said. He winked at Bobby and the three of them went into the house. When Anastasia saw the boy, she was stunned. Ellie's father immediately walked over to the child and extended his hand to him. "Well, hello there. You can call me grandfather," he said. "All right. And you call me Bobby? That's what everybody calls me." "That's a funny name you have," the boy replied. Anastasia walked over to the child, knelt down, and cried. She realized that the boy was an exact replica of Ely. There wasn't even any need for a test. Anastasia realized it all at once. Guilt came over her in such a way that she cried and couldn't stop. That's it. That's enough. Take her away," Ely asked his father. He took his wife upstairs, and the trio went to take a DNA test. Afterward, they went to a cafe where they ate ice cream. Ely occasionally wiped away tears. When Bobby talked about the delicious candy he picked up at the cemetery, Ely said, "I'll never forgive her." Emily understood, and she kind of felt sorry for his mom. She had done such a thing, and now she would have to accept the consequences of her deed. Bobby was now an adult and was starting to ask questions until they answered them, going off topic. Ely and Emily agreed that they would tell the boy everything once the DNA test was ready. When it came time to part ways, Ely realized he didn't want to leave. "How am I going to leave him now?" he asked Emily, completely confused. "I just took him away from his drinking stepfather. He promised me he'd get codependent, but I don't believe it. The boy needs to realize everything, get used to it. Besides, I've got a big shaggy dog at home right now. Let me take it for a walk," Ely begged. He couldn't let them go. Had he just gained a son now? Even if it turned out that Bobby wasn't his own, he was still Iris's child. And that was very meaningful to him. "Okay, come with us." Emily realized that Ely didn't want to break up. Except with whom? With her or with the baby? Or still with the Iris he saw in her and Bobby? Probably all of them. Emily was ashamed to realize that she liked Ely a lot, and she thought her sister would have approved of their union. Those thoughts flashed through her mind against her will. She didn't want to think it. but the feelings arose in her on their own. She had fallen in love with Eli as early as yesterday, when she saw how he had reacted to her, and how much he loved Iris. He wasn't like his mother. There was decency in him. He was the victim in this situation. So was Bobby. So was Iris. And girls separated as children who never saw each other for the rest of their lives could well be considered victims too. But there was no bringing their parents back. There was no one left to ask questions. Iris was gone too. There's only Bobby to tell Eli a joke. There's Eli, secretly wiping away tears as he looks at the baby. Emily realized that he would have stayed asleep on the doorstep just to be near his son. They made their way to her apartment. Bobby and Emily began to clean up. Buddy made a mess. Bobby scolded him and scratched his head. He understood. You could see it in his intelligent eyes. Eli walked Buddy for almost an hour. During that time, Emily made dinner. You know, I feel like you guys are my mom and dad. It's like we have a family, Bobby said to Emily. She wanted terribly badly to tell the boy who she was to him, but she waited for the test result. For some reason, she was scared to talk about it. He'd be sitting in his new room. I'll go set him up at his new school tomorrow, and I'll quietly tell him that his mom was my sister Emily told Leo, okay, if you want, you can stay at my place. It's a comfy couch, she offered. Can I? I hate to leave terribly, but that's the way it's going to be tomorrow. You see, I can't leave him now, and neither can I leave you. It's as if I were tied to you. You're supposed to be a wife, she smiled. Our marriage is a sham, and Eli is my son, so she lied to me. She took me to her doctors, telling me I was infertile. Then one day I found birth control pills on her. She said it was a friend's pills, but I guess I just got caught. We have a really bad relationship. I never loved her, but that doesn't change the fact that you're married. Let me stay because of him. I'll work out my marital status. We'll get back to this conversation. Emily bed Eli on the couch.
She didn't think he was serious. But the very next day, Michael did file for divorce. He didn't even wait for the test results.
What were you missing? Iris asked him. She was angry. Honesty, kids, a wife, and borscht. I'm a husband. Don't you feel like a wife? Running around to your parties, your bohemian parties that make me sick. I want to be at home, watching movies at night. I want the comforts of home. I want to hug my wife, raise my kids, be needed. Do you realize you're married? Iris threw the glass at the wall and didn't answer him. You lied to me that I was infertile, Michael asked. Yes, because I'm not going to ruin my figure for the sake of a schnook, and I did the abortion for you. So get out. I don't care about you, she said venomously. That was the end of their marriage. That evening, after picking up the lab report, Michael walked up the stairs and rang the doorbell. Emily opened it for him. She was wearing no makeup and a house robe. I thought you'd call. Did something happen? She asked. I filed for divorce, and I'm also Bobby's father. A kid showed up behind me. What? I'm your daddy. Michael went downstairs and hugged his son. He and Emily told him the whole truth. Michael had several pictures of Iris. Finally, the boy had a picture of his mom. Emily told her side of the story. That same night, Michael got up the courage to tell her that he wanted to be with them. I know it's rash, but I can't help it. I'm drawn to you. I want to be part of the family since he's my son. Let's raise him together. Let's just try it. Do you want to move in with me? You have a wife, right? No, I have my own apartment. But it's a little far from here. No, it's okay. Bobby just started a new school. You don't have to push him again. I have a big apartment. There's plenty of room for everyone. Stay, the couch is all yours. On one condition, Emily looked at him seriously. What's that? You'll go out with Buddy? Michael laughed. Aren't you a dog person? I am. I was going to get a bald cat on Friday, but now I don't know. At first, Michael flatly refused to talk to his mother and would not show her his grandson. Only Grandpa Edward, who loved Bobby to bits, came to visit. Anastasia could not get through to her son, so one day she came to her mother. She apologized, saying that she repented. Emily and Eli decided to give the grandmother a trial to her grandson. She came to visit them and told them what she had done to his mom. Bobby listened to her with a serious look. I'm sorry, for God's sake. I want to hang out with you so badly. You're my only grandchild, she said. Okay, he smiled and hugged her. Will you forgive me? Grandma repeated. It's not like you killed anyone. And I don't have many grandmothers to throw around, Bobby replied. Eli, following his son's example, also softened. A year later, when the twins were born, Anastasia helped with them and taught the young mom the finer points of infant care. They became a real family. John did get codependent and became an assistant at a rehab clinic for addicts. Bobby sometimes comes to visit him, and there is a new monument in the cemetery. Emily ordered a beautiful headstone for her sister next to the grave that Jessica and Michael made for her. She kept it in memory of what had happened, and if it hadn't been for their horrible act, she would never have found her happiness.